Wednesday, October 28th, 2020. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a Rockfin exclusive to start, unlimited hangout, Last American Vagabond special today, where we are going to be discussing something that we've been talking about a little bit around the side that Whitney Webb has been teasing on Twitter and different places, that is really about this really alarming escalation of where we're going, this sort of where we're seeing the same people tied in with 9/11, essentially simulating for election chaos and different things we're seeing towards the election that seem to benefit the groups that they're involved with, and seeming to blame or set up the blame to be on certain groups that they've been seeding to for us to be afraid of for quite a long time. And all boils down to this kind of problem reaction solution game where they're justifying the things that they've always been trying to put in. And this is all the things we've been talking about on this show. And today this specifically ties in with the escalation of this whole COVID-19 scaremongering tactic, as well as the election and how they're coming together and how this is going to be abused. And Whitney Webb is here to talk about all of her research in this regard, as she's been really leading this, as far as I can tell, everywhere. No one else seems to want to even touch on this stuff. So thank you, Whitney Webb, for joining the dual show, I guess, today. So how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm very happy to collaborate through my page, Unlimited Hangout, with the Last American Vagabond for our quote-unquote election special. It may not be like a lot of other election specials you may be watching in alternative media, because we're talking about things that I have been writing about, and I know Ryan also has been covering for well over a year, that have everything to do with the 2020 election. And, you know, it's very interesting that, you know, we were capable of seeing this, so what is now being framed as the inevitability of chaos in the result of the 2020 election back earlier this year, as early as January, when I published my series on a company called Cybereason that has deep ties to both US and Israeli intelligence and has been simulating chaos for the 2020 general election for well over a year, actually 2 years. And a lot of the things they predicted are exactly what mainstream media is now saying are bound to happen in places like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and other battleground states. So to start off, we're going to show you something very interesting that top officials from DHS were saying earlier this year in March, a month when pretty much most Americans were not paying attention to what DHS was saying, because of course this March is when the coronavirus lockdowns and a lot of the coronavirus crisis really began in earnest and started to upend normal life and usher us in, or attempt to usher us into, the quote-unquote new normal. So with that being said, I'll let Ryan lead on this part.
Yeah, this part was really, really alarming because of the tie-ins of things we've been seeing for such a long time. And whether it's anti-Semitism or other variations of hate, or things that are very real, but that they use to cover or justify removing things that aren't that even remotely, such as our work. And this is the kind of thing we're seeing converge here, that they're justifying this almost government-wide effort to go after what they're claiming is this domestic threat, which is specifically these groups that they claim are somehow collaborating or becoming this kind of foreign entity. And you'll see in this video we're going to watch that they even claim that these groups, these domestic militias they're claiming, which some of these, by the way, are like strict constitutionalists. So it's a really weird situation to see, but that they're calling them foreign entities, even though we're talking about domestic individuals. And I found that to be very, very telling. So this is the article we're talking about here, Homeland Security, and it talks about extremism building to the doorstep of another 9/11, which is the real point here, is that they're seeding this idea that this is going to be the next 9/11. Even this event that hasn't happened yet is already something that they're pointing to. It's very interesting. And of course, the anti-Semitism hearing, which this is really all about. Now let's get to the video, and I'll show you some clips here that I thought really stood out as alarming from more than just the individual that we first noticed. Now let me get this shared for that specific video real quick. Here we go. Okay, so let's take a peek at this. Make sure the sound is good.
Our extraordinary slate of witnesses from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security for coming here today to testify on the federal government's response to the rise in anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. And I'm sure in the process, we'll also be focusing on generally the issue of domestic terrorism. This is not a question.
I want to just add right off the bat that the idea that we're talking about anti-Semitism and the idea that it is domestic terrorism now, right? I mean, Whitney's been pointing this out, like that is, it's So there's plenty of other versions of hate that exist. Why is this one specifically becoming not just, a hate crime or whatever, even though that's wildly undefined, but it's becoming terrorism, right? I mean, it just seems like a really interesting jump that leads into where they're kind of guiding this,
Right.
Of
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that people that watched our video on the seeding of the Dark Winter PSYOP, that they are building towards this bioterror event later in the year, the quote unquote darkest winter in modern US history, we pointed out there that the people that they have already set up to take the blame for that are an alleged domestic extremist group that they're claiming will be white supremacists working with Iran. And of course, it makes no sense if you think about it, why a white supremacist would work with Iranians, but the way they're going, the glue they're using to stick those two groups together is claiming that they're both united in their extreme anti-Semitism. And it's worth pointing out too, the similarities to the 2001 official narrative about September 11th and the anthrax attacks, or rather the initial narrative of the anthrax attacks before that was disproven, that it was Iraq working with a group of terrorists, Al-Qaeda, which of course Al-Qaeda, as we know, was created by the CIA. And it's no coincidence that a lot of these domestic terror groups that are being marched in front of the American public right now is a reason to be afraid. For example, with the Governor Whitmer plot, we now know was incredibly infiltrated by the FBI. The ringleader of that plot was an FBI undercover informant who was paid $24,000 to set up what is essentially a fake terror plot, the same tactic used against Muslim Americans in the aftermath of 9/11. So all of that background is important to keep in mind while we're watching this clip here.
Absolutely. And we also see FBI claiming that they already have undercover individuals in regard to what's going to be happening coming up to the election. I mean, it's
right.
The New York Times has covered this before as well, that even the New York Times, as well as all the independent media, the FBI is involved with something like 90% of the claims that they claim to stop. I have a hand in creating. I mean, that's just staggering, but crazy.
Yeah, and they cover up the real crimes, like the Epstein scandal.
Right.
Anyway.
Right.
Moving along.
And we are not losing sight of jihadi terrorism and the threat that it continues to pose, but there is no doubt these statistics do not lie. The rise of domestic terrorism and the anti-Semitic threads running through it are an incredibly real problem. I've got people in my community, people in communities throughout this country that are afraid to go outside wearing their kippah, afraid to congregate, afraid to observe the high holy days.
Except in New York where they're protesting outside and whatever else, but no big deal. But statistics happen to lie all the time, by the way. That's a completely false statement.
And people generally are now afraid to do things that they were not afraid to do just a few years ago. We have certainly seen the rise of a global neo-Nazi white nationalist movement that is deserving of our attention.
You mean like in Ukraine? We're not supposed to say that one though, right?
No. But remember how they're calling the people like behind the Governor Whitmer plot, they started calling them vanilla ISIS. Notice what this guy was saying, that he's basically linking, he talked about jihadi terror and then immediately goes to this global network of neo-Nazi stuff. If you go back, by the way, and you didn't watch our video about the coronathrax experiment and the stuff about the seeding for this bioterror attack narrative later on in the year and the darkest winter and all of that, you should really go back and watch it, because we explored a lot of who they're going to blame in terms of the alleged domestic actors in pretty great detail there.
Experts have said that this looks like what Al-Qaeda looked like in the 80s and the 90s.
So predictable.
Let's not find ourselves asleep at the wheel.
How do they even argue that they look even remotely close to what that? I mean, that's incredible, but it's perfect timing.
No, well, actually, if you think about it, it does make sense, because Al Qaeda was, I mean, even now the U.S. is supporting Al Qaeda in Syria and Yemen. They've always been, they always have been a front for U.S. intelligence. They were created to be that. You had people like Jamal Khashoggi embedded with Al-Qaeda in the 1980s during Operation Cyclone, which began under the Carter administration. Millions upon millions of dollars more funneled to Al-Qaeda during the 1980s by the Reagan administration, the same administration responsible for Iran-Contra. And a lot of those people later went on to be part of the George W. Bush administration, and also Papa Bush, right? So I mean, it's just you know, outrageous. So in that sense, yeah, a lot of these supposed domestic extremist groups are also infiltrated by the military or the feds or intelligence, right? So I guess in that sense, he's not wrong, but of course that's not what he wants you to think. But
Right.
you know,
Right.
Freudian slip, perhaps.
Yes, yes, he's correct when you're actually looking at the facts, right? But when you listen to the narrative, that doesn't make any sense. So that's kind of confusing, right? Don't just trust what the
Right.
government says. Go back to sleep. That's the point.
Yeah.
Did in the run-up to 9/11. For so many people in my community, it feels like 9/11 was yesterday. These organizations, it is my opinion, and I'm not the only one, need to be identified as foreign terrorist organizations. And if they are not identified as foreign terrorist organizations, you need to tell us that we are still protected.
It's almost like he didn't know what he was going to say right there. He just didn't. He doesn't. We just tell us to, you know, designate them. Well, how can they be foreign if we're talking about a domestic? That doesn't even make sense to me. But it doesn't even matter, right?
Well, I think it's part of this narrative that they're trying to spin in, that these alleged domestic extremists are part of a global network, which you sort of alluded to earlier, and that we sort of need to slap on them these quote unquote domestic.
Uh-oh, looked like we lost you for a second. Just usually it will come right back. I hope. We'll see. Whitney, if you can hear me, I'm going to keep playing the video while your video catches up.
We need to know that when people in America go to train overseas, when people in America are recruited, when people try to come to America who have trained with these organizations.
Okay, sorry. If you were saying something, go ahead and say it. We lost you there for a minute. They cut out the internet connection. You still there? Ah, shoot. Looks like we're losing you again. But while it's connecting again, I'm sure we'll get you back. This is the point where he's saying right here that he's trying to make this tie, right? This is exactly what Whitney was just saying. He's making this connection as if they go overseas and train. We're talking about groups that are constitutionalists in some cases, and they're claiming that they're going overseas to train with Iran or some other group. They're trying to conflate with this. It makes no sense at all. Are you back? Did you want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, I am back, but I lost my train of thought. I'm not really sure what's going on with my internet. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Just go ahead and run with the clip. It's fine.
Okay.
You have the same tools at your disposal that you do and have had in the fight against jihadi terrorism.
Earlier this month, FBI Director Wray testified that the Bureau had elevated racially motivated violent extremism to a threat level on par, kind of what Chairman Rose was talking about it, with Islamist terrorism. In response, the FBI has established a new fusion cell to better coordinate the response to domestic terrorism and hate crimes, and joint terrorism task forces across the United States have been instructed to increase their focus on domestic terrorism.
Wow. Okay,
Right,
so really quick, that is the part of the FBI, that task force, right? The one that was involved in the entrapment of Muslim Americans to gin up the claim that there were all these Muslim extremists that were going to conduct terror attacks within the United States. And now he's saying that's merging with this new group that wants to focus on this threat of domestic terrorism. Well, there you go. This was in March, and I think that is the exact entity that was probably responsible for this Governor Whitmer plot, since we know now that it was an FBI informant leading the whole thing with 24 grand to spend. Unbelievable.
Exactly. Yeah, and I had these up just so people can look into it, so you understand what these are. Whitney just gave you the rundown there, and this is some crazy stuff. And you'll see as they go forward with this video, they're talking about these. So this is essentially these fusion centers where they're working with communities and different groups, and you'll be surprised to find out which one of those groups are. And he'll drop it here in a second. But you need to ask yourself, if these groups are working with them and they're the ones giving them information, is it possible that they're the ones in some part either guiding it or leading the direction of who they go after or who they frame? Certainly a good question to ask. Let's go back to the video.
My mind is already blown.
Yeah.
We're just starting. Oh man.
Collaborating,
Oh, sorry.
communicating at a high level in joint terrorism task forces across the country, and also within the numerous fusion centers throughout the nation. Our partnerships include non-law enforcement agencies, from tech companies to faith-based organizations like the Anti-Defamation League.
Oh, there it is. So tech companies and the
man.
ADL are essentially seeding them with information, which they use to then go after terrorists. You think that's important, Whitney?
Yeah, because the ADL, their biggest funders are members of the mega group that I talk about in my Epstein series, historically anyway, like the Bronfman family, And people like that have long been Ronald Lauder, huge funders of that organization. We also know that Pierre Omidyar, who we've talked about before, is the person that gave ADL the seed money to set up their quote unquote hate lab in Silicon Valley. And Pierre Omidyar, of course, has been at the forefront of trying to deplatform independent media as quote unquote fake news, and this whole fact checker thing. And, you know, that whole initiative has been partnered with the ADL, and the ADL has a history of functioning as a lobby organization for the Israeli government and trying to criminalize criticism of Israel's government as anti-Semitic, and trying to, you know, anyone that stands up for Palestinian rights or supports the boycott and divestment sanctions movement, or BDS, you know, the ADL essentially labels them as anti-Semitic. I mean, they're a very problematic organization that has, you know, they certainly don't like the First Amendment as it relates to criticism of their organization. Also, the ADL was born out of an organization called B'nai B'rith, which is quite controversial. And well, I mean, that's a story for another day, but you know, it's worth looking into the founding of the ADL and Leo Frank and things like that, and who they were set up to protect. Essentially, they also have longstanding ties to the National Crime Syndicate and the Meyer Lansky organized crime mob going back decades. So to see them partnering with the federal government in what has already appeared to have resulted in a, you know, fake terror plot is really alarming.
Very, very much so. I mean, the ADL itself, I mean, well, just let's say the use of anti-Semitism to remove genuine criticism of government actions is exactly what they use, a lot of groups use to remove genuine things that need to be discussed. And they argue that not that, well, maybe that's not what they say, but that's what they mean. And now they're deciding what we're implying with statements, and then we're just supposed to assume that they might not just have that opinion outside of the thing they say. And this is the way that they apply these things. And by the way, this video in the last part of here gets into exactly the idea of free speech and your constitutional rights. And you'll find it interesting what she has to say, that it happens to bump up against other people's fear. And you can, I'm sure you guess which one trumps which. Let's watch.
I can tell you from my time in the upper Midwest, one of our best partners was and still is the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. These relationships are working. In just the first quarter of this fiscal year, these types of partnerships have assisted JTTFs across the country in disrupting and arresting 38 terrorism subjects right here in the United States. I think there are two particular.
So just so we didn't miss that, we're talking about Joint Terrorism Task Force with these community members, and that specific Jewish community, along with the ADL, were insisting with their stopping these groups that were supposed to, you know, we have to wonder whether or not there's some other agendas playing in with all of this, right? I mean, that's an obvious question.
Drawn out. The first is the way in which online platforms catalyze hate. To a rabbi whose children were targeted online, and I'm very encouraged by Adi and Sanborn to see that they are looking to try to use all the tools that they currently have to try to go after such horrible things. But the fact is that our law enforcement community feels hamstrung. And how do you go after and balance First Amendment rights to free speech? While at the same time, how do you not acknowledge that innocent children being projected with images online that will forever be online? What about their rights?
Their rights to what? Not have things on the internet that may come across their views?
She's talking about that reference she made to that rabbi's kids being bullied. But like, what about all the kids? And I mean, they're not worried about, like, you know, like the exploitation of children by people like Jeffrey Epstein. Why didn't you investigate that, losers?
Well, but
you know, what about, you know, all the children the U.S. government bombs abroad, you know, and sanctions and all of this stuff. I mean, it's really a transparent, you know, posturing here that they're trying. I mean, it just honestly sounds like they're pandering to a specific lobby here.
Totally. But the point is not to say that what happened to these children is not something that shouldn't happen, or so. There's already laws in the books that go after things like this. You know, what she's saying there is that that they feel hamstrung because your rights are getting in the way of them stopping that from happening. That's what she just said, right?
Yeah,
and so she's making the statement that that's what we need to alleviate. And the idea is that their rights, and what rights does she mean? People who post things online. First of all, they're assuming that they know what those person's intentions were and that it wasn't some group that's trying to make the case for why this needs to happen. So you see what I mean? They've already shown examples of people faking things like this, and not just about anti-Semitism, but all cases. So not, so it's a broad thing, not just about this one discussion. But I find that to be incredibly obvious that they're saying that that is the issue. Your rights get in the way of them protecting people from having things happen to them, or in regard to online, or that she just said that they're on the internet forever. Like, so this is a really obvious thing that's applying to the broad sense of just things being there. Like, so they go and look at them and that's your fault, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, really quick, I wanted to add, well, we're going to get more into this later, but a lot of the companies we're going to be talking about have ties not just to U.S. intelligence, but Israeli intelligence. And of course, after any sort of another 9/11 takes place, anyone that would point the finger at the Israeli involvement, perhaps, they set it up as, oh, it's anti-Semitism from the get-go now. I mean, this is from March, right? And so, it's definitely a way to clamp down on anyone that would attempt to investigate the event after the fact and sort of dismiss them as sympathizers to whatever this domestic group is going to be, saying it's all anti-Semitism, or if you oppose a war with Iran, it's because you're anti-Semitic as well, among other things. I mean, we have seen groups like the ADL throw the anti-Semitic label around and try and tack it to things that are honestly just ludicrous. So, I mean, I think that's part of why this is being set up here, because a lot of the companies, for example, Cybereason, which is one of the companies we're going to be talking about today, was founded by members of Israeli intelligence, but of course, as I mentioned, also considerable ties to U.S. intelligence and the Project for a New American Century neocons. But, this is a way of stopping debate. And, a former foreign minister for Israel even admitted, I think on Democracy Now! Several years ago, she said that the anti-Semitism label is a trick. That's her term. She says we always use it when we don't want people to criticize us or clamp down on debate. And what do you know? What's going on here? I mean, it's just quite telling what they're setting up here.
She mentions it in this. I don't have it in this clip, but there's a part where a different person mentions the idea that there are people, spray painting things and saying that, Jews are behind 9/11. And that one statement, whoever made that, we don't know who it could be from, is something that is then used to point out that anybody saying that Israel's government was in any way involved is then that's what they really mean. And so the question should be genuinely asked whether things like that are being done, not that they don't actually happen in real life, but could be being done in places where people like this can talk about it so that that statement can be made, right? And this is something that the groups, again, troll farms, whether Israeli, United States, or any other country, are openly admitting to that they do today. Not just spray painting things and blaming people, but using psychological manipulations and counterintelligence. They've done this forever. That's literally what they do. So it's not wrong to ask those questions because we're talking about the Israeli government and the crimes that they're, I think, clearly involved in.
And so there's that tension there. And then we also know that we have these organizations or movements or individuals that some of them are very sophisticated. They know exactly how far they can go. They're training their people to say, you can go this far, but not any farther. They are being sophisticated in both their communications and in their messaging. So
this is an interesting point about QAnon they just recently brought up. And this is the idea that what she's saying there as well, they're not doing the thing that we just said was bad. They're just under the bar now. But now because they are hiding, we have to take it even further. And how long will that continue until it's just, you can't say anything even remotely insinuating these kind of things, right? And that's how this continues to escalate.
Good point.
We're playing a game and we are not equipped to go after that game effectively because of the rules that we are using.
Wow, there it is.
Quite frankly, designed 50 years ago. So I think it's probably time to take a fresh look. We do regulate other parts of speech over airwaves. It's hard for me to understand why on the online side, we're not willing to look at that.
Because we're talking about radio shows and not individuals posting individual comments online, which is what she's talking about. But sure, your rights just get in our way, right? That's what she's saying right there.
That's outrageous. I mean, we're in the months since this happened, people have to remember this was being said, this testimony happened in March. I mean, just look at the social media censorship efforts and efforts to curb speech online. All of how that has advanced over the course of this year. And obviously, if there is some sort of false flag event, another 9/11, as these people are warning, you can just imagine what other kinds of controls they'll try and, put on the internet.
Absolutely. And this last part is where the big statement is made here in regard to that.
Mhm.
Second thing you raised about the domestic terrorist groups and movements being designated, I think it's definitely worth looking at whether we need a new DTO designation or movement designation, or maybe just relook at the whole entire framework. The national security apparatus is designed for a threat from 2030.
You want to comment?
No, I'm just, wow, I mean, we can see where this is going. People like us have been warning that this was going to happen for a long time. So it's really crazy to hear her lay it all out, I guess.
Insinuate a technocratic revolution, our entire infrastructure revolution. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's basically like, well, she's like, well, we could make a new designation for them, but that can't really work. So we have to remake the whole framework so it fits what we want it to fit. I mean, that's essentially what she's saying. And they did that after 9/11. Remember, they remade the whole national security apparatus, the intelligence community, to expand it and remake information sharing between agencies, what they wanted. They claimed that was the reason 9/11 happened, is because there wasn't enough information sharing between agencies. So that, of course, opened pretty much every part of the US government to the US intelligence community. They can get in and see whatever the rest of them were doing and all of that stuff, right? So, I mean, it's the same playbook these people follow every damn time. It's nuts.
And clearly it worked out great for Americans, right? And everyone, this is perfect. It all worked out for us, right?
Yeah. Here's DHS that was going to prevent terrorism, and here they are essentially talking about in advance exactly what's going to happen, and working with the FBI and FBI entrapment plots. I mean, it's just these are the people manufacturing the crisis they're claiming to warn about. So,
And the world is changing, and every counterterrorism professional I speak to in the federal government and overseas feels like we are at the doorstep of another 9/11, maybe not something that catastrophic in terms of the visual or the numbers, but that we can see it building and we don't quite know how to stop it. And so this feels like one of those moments where having smart people, academics, lawyers, people that can appreciate that we as a country have abused authority in the past, McCarthyism, internment of Japanese during World War II. We don't have a great track record here. We need to do this wisely. And it probably is not
wisely
in our normal course of business. It feels like this is a time for some sort of bipartisan commission to go off and study this problem and come back with a holistic view of this.
Wow.
Well, I just want to point out the thing that she said, this is a top lady at DHS, by the way. She said every counterterrorism professional she speaks with in the US government agrees, they all agree we're on the doorstep of another 9/11. That was how many months ago now? Back in March, right? So a lot's happened since then. I guess we're a little past the doorstep now, per her. And she also says counterterrorism professionals overseas, we can assume those are the US's closest allies, counterterrorism professionals in the United Kingdom, the Five Eyes countries, and Israel.
It's just crazy to watch this so plainly happening. And it's so, what really is incredible to me is that the things that you've been writing about and predicting this stuff and just literally calling what's going to happen. And yet, I mean, and even getting pretty spread, people are talking about it. I mean, people are mentioning you on the Joe Rogan show just the other day. And yet, nonetheless, it seems as if people still are afraid to point this out. It's happening right in front of us, and you called it months ago, right? I mean, I just don't understand.
Well, this is controversial information. A lot of people don't want to put their reputation or, their YouTube channels or things like that on the line, right? But honestly, in my opinion, based on what they're trying to do here, we are out of time for that. If I wanted to think about preserving my career, well, based on what they're setting up, and this clampdown on online speech that will follow this event, I won't have a career. So it's sort of one of those moments like speak up now or forever hold your peace, is how I see it.
Or forever be forced to, yeah.
Right, yeah, against your will. So with that being said, I don't know if you have anything else to share on that point in terms of that testimony from the DHS people, or I can just go into my series back from January about that sort of predicted a lot of what we're seeing now.
Yeah, please continue.
Alrighty, so just give me 1 second here. So after my Epstein series, I did another series on a company that has some ties to some of the same actors, Israeli intelligence and also US intelligence, called Cybereason. This is back when I wrote for Mint Press News. As you can see here, this is part 1 of the series. It came out on January 4th, 2020. It's a 3-part series. The last one, I believe, came out on January 28th, 2020. I ended up highlighting the version of my article of that same article I republished in my site Unlimited Hangout, just because I think it's a little easier to read and highlight than the how Mint Press has their color scheme set up. So first off, I'm going to go into what company Cybereason is, and why it matters, and then talk a little bit about their election simulations and what they predicted. And obviously, I think a lot of people will pick up on the similarities between what Cybereason predicted over a year in advance and what's happening now, and wondering if any of these extreme intelligence ties have anything to do with it. So what type of company is Cybereason? Well, if you actually look into what they do, it doesn't have very much to do with election security. So it's odd for them to be running simulations about doomsday simulations, really about the 2020 election. So as I point out here, it seems a little odd, their interest in terror attacks on election day, which is what they simulated, not manipulations of vote counts or anything like that. They simulated terror attacks on election day for the US in 2020. So if you look at what Cybereason actually does, they sell cybersecurity solutions, essentially AI-driven, rather more sophisticated than antivirus software of the past, and also ransomware protection software. As I highlighted here, it uses a lot of artificial intelligence, cloud computing. The cloud they use is Amazon Web Services, which of course is pretty standard throughout the US national security, state, and other federal agencies. Straight from the horse's mouth, the former senior director for intelligence at Cybereason, he left relatively recently, says this about Cybereason's founders. Our founders are ex-Israeli intelligence who worked on the offensive side. They basically wanted to build a tool that would catch themselves. We follow the kill chain model started by Lockheed Martin, which, as we'll get into a moment, is one of Cybereason's main investors, and a key part of the quote-unquote military industrial intelligence complex. Anyway, and try to interrupt every stage once an intruder's inside a target network. And here is Lior Div, Cybereason's CEO, saying that what they do on their platform is leverage artificial intelligence to be able to autonomously identify attackers, meaning that it doesn't really involve people so much, it's an automated process. So essentially, if you take that, give that an objective look, the only real innovative part of Cybereason is that they tweaked Lockheed Martin's existing model to be automated. And what they use as their main selling point, however, is how the company has deep ties to the military and military intelligence, and this sets them apart. They, in the past anyway, at least when I wrote this series, emphasized that to a great degree, slightly less now after my series first came out and got some attention.
I think it's a relevant question for people out there. We've talked in the past about Israel's government abusing the situation with the US, and even, like, let's say the one that most people are aware of, the fact that they stole nuclear technology from the US government, and that's why they have a nuclear program. That's something that's easy to look up. So in this case, when we're talking about the ex-Israeli intelligence running this to catch themselves or so on, it seems the question should be, is it not what happens if maybe Israel's government is the one doing it? I'm sure they won't be catching themselves in that case, or the US government.
Well, we'll be getting into a little more the background of the specific people that founded Cybereason and their ties to companies that have been rather scandalous for what they have done in terms of spying on the US federal government in the past. But for now, just want to go through this product, what they do as a company, because it really shows that their claimed justification for these election simulations, their official justifications for it, really don't hold any water. So anyway, moving along. They've already expanded and are prominent in the Internet of Things market and advanced healthcare systems. This, of course, is before the move to telehealth and all that stuff since the coronavirus crisis. So Cybereason conveniently positioned to benefit from that, as were a lot of intelligence-connected tech companies, not just Israeli intelligence, obviously US intelligence-connected tech companies like Google, among others, right? So anyway, Cybereason has a presence in the US, Europe, Israel, recently expanding into Asia and Latin America. They're very secretive about their financial performance. Moving on, they have a security research arm called Nocturnus that is run and largely staffed by people that are from Unit 8200, which is an Israeli military intelligence agency, often described as Israel's equivalent of the National Security Agency, or NSA. What Nocturnus does is that it functions basically like a private intelligence company, and they have been behind several claims that were cited without any sort of scrutiny by mainstream media in the US, attributing alleged hacks over the past 3 to 4 years or so to China and North Korea specifically, which of course have been used in recent months to say, look at China's history of hacking US systems in the lead up to the US election, where they say China and Iran, among other groups, are set to target US critical infrastructure. So that's worth keeping in mind. But as I note here, this security research arm of Cybereason, Nocturnus, they do their research using Cybereason's global network of millions of endpoints for its intelligence gathering and research, right? Which basically, as I point out here, means the endpoints of every device to which Cybereason's software has access. And so this company is very much embedded in the US private sector, but also in the other parts of the world I pointed out earlier, Europe, Israel, and beyond. But they're also very much embedded these days in the US public sector, the government, which we can get to in a moment. So as I point out here, given what Cybereason provides as a company, their interest in offering election simulations to government officials free of charge seems a little odd, because there was no way for them to market their software based on what was simulated in the election, because in their election simulation, because it didn't, the simulation, as we'll show in a moment, did not involve any sort of attacks on election infrastructure at all. And what they did instead was use deep fakes, disinformation, and terror attacks, things like that. So moving on to the people behind Cybereason. Cybereason was created in 2012, and this year, the fact it was made this year is very significant. We'll get to that at the end of this article. But it was created in 2012 by 3 Israelis, all of whom were elite members of Unit 8200, which I pointed out here. Unit 8200 is an elite unit of the Israeli Intelligence Corps and is part of the IDF's Directorate of Military Intelligence, involved mainly in signal intelligence, surveillance, cyber warfare, and code decryption. It is well known for its surveillance of Palestinian citizens and using intercepted communications as blackmail in order to procure informants among Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank as a way of advancing the agenda of the Israeli national security state. So here's, well, I'll move on from that. But what's important in this paragraph here is that the NSA of the US and Unit 8200 have a long-standing collaborative relationship, best known for producing the Stuxnet virus, long considered to be the most damaging cyber attack in the history of the world. The target, of course, was Iran, who, allegedly is going to be hacking US infrastructure ahead of the 2020 election, just as Israel wants us to go to war with them. Weird. Anyway, so the current CEO and co-founder of Cybereason is Lior Div, according to a brief bio of his. When Div was in Unit 8200, he was a commander, and he carried out some of the world's largest cyber offensive campaigns against nations. Okay. So this is a guy that offensively and aggressively hacked other countries that were targets of Israel.
And I hope pointing out clear that that's illegal, right? That's not some, you're a good guy fighting for freedom and that's allowed. That's an illegal action no matter how you spin it.
Yeah, but not only that, but during the years where Div was there was an NSA document that was actually released as part of the Edward Snowden cache, where the NSA said that the third most aggressive nation state in hacking the United States was Israel after Russia and China, straight from the US government itself. So interesting to see that Div was involved in the world's largest cyber offensive campaigns against nations and cyber crime groups also. But I mean, this is a big deal that this is the guy that's in charge of Cybereason and simulating all this stuff about the election. And he received the Medal of Honor. Good for him. Okay.
Talk about wolf in the hen house, right? I mean, that's like the best analogy here. That's exactly what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other two co-founders of Cybereason that were also in Unit 8200, after they left Israeli intelligence officially, worked for something called Gita Technologies, which is a subsidiary of Verint, which used to be known as Comverse Infosys. Okay, so Verint or Comverse was initially funded by the Israeli government. It was founded by Kobi Alexander, a former Israeli intelligence officer who was wanted by the FBI on nearly 36 charges of fraud, theft, lying, bribery, money laundering, and other crimes for over a decade. And then he was finally extradited to the US and was only pled guilty to just a handful of the things that he was actually initially charged with. Anyway. Despite its history of corruption and foreign intelligence connections, Verint and Comverse was actually hired by the NSA to create backdoors into all major US telecommunication systems and major tech companies, including Facebook, Microsoft, and Google.
People should ask themselves right there, what do you think a company or a government would do if that was what was happening to them? Do they then just hire that criminal and put them on the payroll and work with them? Or does that signify or indicate that there's more collaboration going on between these entities than adversarial, or maybe one group that has more control over the other, or so on? I mean, these are honest questions based on why a government would work with a group that just did that or is known to do that to the US government. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely crazy. I mean, things we can point to regarding the NSA and the Unit 8200 relationship, it's worth pointing out that former NSA Director Mike Rogers, now working for a company run by the former commander of Unit 8200 and funded by Google's Eric Schmidt. Team 8, Keith Alexander, another former NSA director, also gets a bunch of money from Team 8 via his private company, IronNet Cybersecurity. So, I mean, the NSA and the relationship with Israel's its Israeli equivalent is definitely concerning, but obviously complicated, and definitely, it's pretty clear here, not exactly acting in the best interest of U.S. national security at all, because a company like, that's deeply tied to Israeli intelligence, like Verint or Comverse, to think that they want to keep these back doors for itself. Okay, the NSA will give you your back door, but to think they want to keep it for themselves when Israel has a documented history of selling backdoored software to the US government. I mean, just look at the Promise software scandal, which by the way involved Robert Maxwell quite intimately. I mean, it's outrageous. Anyway, an article on Verint's access to US tech infrastructure in Wired said the following about Verint, and this is where they essentially admit that companies like Verint, even though they're private companies, are greatly influenced by Unit 8200. So this retired general, a former commander of Unit 8200, noted his former organizations, meaning Unit 8200's, influence on Comverse, which owns Verint, as well as other Israeli companies that dominate the US eavesdropping and surveillance market. I mean, that's just outrageous. Anyway, as I note here, federal agents for years have reported systemic breaches at the Department of Justice, the FBI, the DEA, and the State Department, and even the White House, going all the way back to the 1990s. Breaches they claimed could all be traced back to just two companies, Comverse Verint and Amdocs. Cybereason's other co-founder, the one that didn't work for a Verint subsidiary, was Lior Div, who instead worked for Amdocs. I mean, this is so outrageous. This company is insane, honestly.
It's macabrely comical to watch how stupidly obvious it is. But wasn't there also a tie-in with Israel using something in regard to the White House and beginning of Trump's administration that they just ignored?
Oh, yeah, there was a surveillance apparatus near the White House that was allegedly acquiring White House communications that I think someone in the federal government, maybe the FBI or DHS, I can't remember, off the record said that it was tied to Israel, and then Israel denied it. But it's worth pointing out that Amdocs in the late 1990s actually tapped the phones of the White House, and that is how Netanyahu got the tapes of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky before anyone else, and attempted to use that as leverage over Bill Clinton for various means. Anyway, story for another day. Moving on. After leaving Amdocs, Lior Div founded a company called AlphaTech. AlphaTech on LinkedIn claims to specialize in headhunting and quality recruiting services, but it doesn't have a website. And Israeli media reports, in great contrast, say that Alpha Tech is a cybersecurity services company for Israeli government agencies. So they've never given any reason for the obvious disconnect in their public profile and what other people say they actually do. Div left that Israeli government contractor in 2012 to create Cybereason alongside these people working for Comverse Infosys subsidiary that were also in Unit 8200 with him. This is probably the most outrageous quote ever, though. All right, so according to an interview that Div gave to TechCrunch in 2019, he stated in early 2019, he stated that his work at Cybereason is, quote, the continuation of the 6 years of training and service he spent working with the Israeli Army's Unit 8200. So he's literally saying his work at Cybereason is the continuation of his time at Unit 8200. If this doesn't scream front company to you, I don't know what does. And as we'll see in a little bit, in 2012 is the year that Israel's government made a deliberate policy to outsource intelligence operations that used to be done by intelligence agencies to private companies, specifically cybersecurity. And one of the companies created out of that new policy was Black Cube. They admit that. So Cybereason has all the markings of being just, another one of those. Anyway, I already mentioned this.
And for those who want to know more about Black Cube, as well as some other ones that I feel are tied in the same vein, we've talked about that a lot on the show. I think actually with Whitney in the past before, but it's very clear that these companies there's obvious track records. At the very least, whether you believe that's what this one is doing, there's ample evidence to be asking these questions. And yet when we do ask these obvious questions that make sense, we get attacked as anti-Semitic. Think about why that doesn't make sense.
Oh, man. Yeah. So anyway, going on to Cybereason's ties to intelligence. Yes, there's more. So not only do Cybereason's co-founders have all these ties to intelligence and say it's a continuation of their ties in intelligence or whatever, another part of Cybereason is very secretive, but they still have a presence on their website. They're called the Cybereason Intelligence Group, or CIG. They describe them as follows. The Cybereason Intelligence Group was formed with the unique mission of providing context to the most sophisticated threat actors. The group's members include experts in cybersecurity and international security from various government agencies, including Unit 8200. And their primary purpose, meaning this intelligence group's purpose, is to examine and explain the who and why behind cyber attacks, so that companies and individuals can better protect themselves. Okay, so basically what they're saying is that the Cybereason Intelligence Group that's operating as part of Cybereason contains active members of different government agencies, including active members of Unit 8200, who are anonymously assigning blame and motives to cyber attacks that take place on the global stage. Which is a convenient way to seed a narrative of who is hacking the US or who is hacking the UK without any sort of accountability. Because when you're able to do this as a private company and you assign blame saying this hack was China, this hack was Iran, you don't have the same sort of issues you run into if you're openly associated with Israel's government or openly associated with the US government and point the finger and go on the record and say it was this country, right? So you can literally have no evidence that it was any sort of state actor, but because you're an active member of a particular intelligence agency, you want to blame that country for that attack. You can do so by operating as a group just like this. So this is very alarming.
It also provides a little bit of a disconnect for people that aren't reading into it and looking into the information, where you've got one entity that's saying, this happened and here's who did it. And then you got seemingly a different entity saying, oh, well, here's why and here's the reasoning, right? So people see those as two separate things when really it's the same entity with the same ties. You got to think about the average person out there that's not researching these things and how they think, the simple ways that they manipulate their perception. It's an interesting point.
Right, good point. So here I point out that this Cybereason Intelligence Group, their reports focus exclusively on blaming Russia and China for hacks. And lo and behold, who are we being told is going to hack the 2020 election under the same sort of circumstances that Cybereason itself simulated for over 2 years? This is just really disconcerting. So when discussing nation state cyber threats in general, Cybereason's website only mentions China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia by name, all of which are incidentally rival states of the US. Notably, Israel's government, as I mentioned earlier, named as a leading espionage threat to US financial institutions and federal agencies by the NSA itself, is absent from Cybereason's discussion of state actors. What do you know? Bam. All right. Then here I talk about how Nocturnus, another part of Cybereason, also has been assigning blames to nation states for specific hacks. Anyway, I go into Cybereason's advisory board here. There you have Robert Bigman, who was the former Chief Information Security Officer for decades for the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. While he was at the CIA, he oversaw the agency's commercial partner engagement program, meaning its alliances with Silicon Valley and the tech sector. And he's one of the main advisors to Cybereason. According to his biography, Robert Bigman, quote, contributed to almost every intelligence community information security policy and has provided numerous briefings to the National Security Council, Congress, and presidential commissions. And this guy is working for, like, what is an openly admitted by the CEO, right, of a front company for a foreign intelligence agency. And this is what he used to do. Outrageous.
And remember, in that video we just watched too, they mentioned that one of the tech companies are one of these community entity groups that they're working with in regard to their joint terrorism task force. And it's interesting that there's another example of Cybereason having a tie to the tech companies, which then feed that information. That's interesting.
Yes, isn't it? So Robert Bigman, despite being, this guy deeply tied to US intelligence, is also an advisor to another Israeli tech company called Sepio Systems. The chairman of Sepio Systems is Tamar Pardo, who is a former head of Israel's Mossad. And Sepio is funded by the creators of the NSO Group, which you may know for its scandals related to the spying of rights activists, among other things, by Saudi Arabia and other countries. They've gotten in quite a bit of trouble for that in recent years, but nothing to see here, I guess, huh? So moving along, Cybereason's advisory board also includes Pinchas Bucharest, who is the former head of Unit 8200. He used to be, I think he may still be, on the board of APAC, by the way, and he was also former managing director of the IDF. He used to, at the time this article was written, he was on the board of directors of Carbine 911 alongside Ehud Barak and Nicole Junkerman, both well-known associates of intelligence-linked sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein himself funded Carbine to the tune of at least $1 million. We'll be talking more about Carbine 911 in a little bit because it's very relevant. But Bucharest, along with Barak and Junkerman, were all mysteriously dropped from Carbine 911's board because of the Epstein scandal. And wait till you see who they replaced them with. Wow, it's pretty nuts. Anyway, another notable Cybereason advisor is the former commissioner of the Boston Police Department, Edward Davis, who actually, after they removed Pinchas Bucharest from the board of Carbine 911, it's Edward Davis who was put in his place. So we have that link there between Cybereason and Carbine 911 anyway. Davis has heavily promoted Cybereason's disturbing election day simulations, and he even participated directly in one of them. And that very simulation, by the way, I'll show you guys in a second, is honestly the most eerie regarding the official narrative about what's about to transpire in the US 2020 election. But anyway, Davis is important because he was the top cop in Boston at the time of the Boston Marathon bombing, which, if you remember back to that, saw the imposition of near martial law-like conditions throughout Boston during the manhunt for the alleged perpetrators of that bombing. Here I provide a link about the odd relationship between the alleged bombers and the FBI. If you want to read about that, you can go to my article and follow the link there, because it's
recommend you do, guys.
Rabbit hole.
Yeah, but that's an important one to understand, everybody out there.
Right. So this is particularly notable, this tie-in, because as we'll see in a moment, Cybereason's election day simulations ended with martial law being imposed on the fictional city used in the exercise. Anyway, Cybereason's other advisors include people at Google, at Lockheed Martin, and Motorola. Motorola and Lockheed both use Cybereason software on all of their company computers, and Lockheed Martin is a major investor in Cybereason, as I mentioned earlier.
You could also argue, I mean, obviously Lockheed Martin stands to benefit with any potential war type chaos, but also Motorola tied in. There seems to be a kind of profit motive there for them to be involved with these kind of things, with the tech aspect to it.
Right. So really quick, just to end this part about it being, Cybereason essentially being a front company. Here I linked to this interview in Israeli media where Israel's government admits this policy in 2012 here about how cyber-related and intelligence projects that were previously carried out in-house in the Israeli military and Israel's main intelligence arms were transferred to companies that in some cases were built for that exact purpose. And if you go and read this article, which I highly recommend you do, it says that one of the companies built for this exact purpose is Black Cube, which, by the way, the head of Black Cube until his death was Meir Dagan, an ex-head of Mossad, who told 60 Minutes, the U.S. news program, that Israel wants the U.S. to go to war with Iran for it, so it can be a quote-unquote international war, and it doesn't just have to be Israel's war. Something to keep in mind there. And here's another discussion of the blurred lines between Israel's intelligence apparatus and its private tech sector, which has actually even made it into Foreign Policy magazine in 2018. So these are some, extra information on that if you'd like to read it. And a lot of the stuff we ended up already covering. Oh, well, this part's important. So as we mentioned earlier, Cybereason, their main product is antivirus and a network defense platform. A former NSA operator, talking about something else, of course, but he told the New York Times that antivirus programs, just like the one that Cybereason markets, is, quote, the ultimate backdoor, and that such a backdoor would provide consistent, reliable, and remote access that can be used for any purpose, from launching a destructive attack to conducting espionage on thousands or even millions of users.
Wow.
So something to keep in mind.
That's really huge. I mean, what she just laid out for you is the idea that that's what they're building, and they just straight up telling you that they have this back door, but let's pretend like that's not possible to be a backdoor into the United States. And that kind of manipulation that will lead into our conversations we'll be having today. That's just so incredible to me that this stuff is so clear. And just because people are afraid to be labeled anti-Semitic or afraid to, claim that an ally could be doing something like this,
right,
that's left right out in the open. It's incredible.
Well, what this intelligence agency, Israeli intelligence agency, is doing, though, is weaponizing Jewish identity as a way to protect its own operations, and that is actually feeding anti-Semitism. They don't actually care, it seems, about people of their own ethno-religious group and what sort of things may happen to them as a consequence of their actions. It's just very alarming.
Well put.
Anyway, this is going into Operation Blackout, which is the name of Cybereason's election simulation. It's worth pointing out that one of the things that Cybereason has simulated in relation to elections is the power grid being taken down, something that we've heard hinted may happen in 2020. And so it's interesting the name is Operation Blackout. Anyway, here I just start off talking about how last November of a year before the election that's about to take place, Cybereason hosted a 2020 election simulation with DHS, the FBI, who we were just talking about and what they're doing, right? And the US Secret Service. The simulation was organized by Cybereason, the law firm Venable, and US agencies appear not to have been charged to participate.
If the Secret Service is involved, I think that clearly implies that the Trump administration is involved, right? Like, for the people that might wonder whether or not there's involvement here with the current administration, I think it's clear that that is the case.
It's possible, but I don't want to speculate too much because a lot of this stuff here is already controversial enough. So anyway, so the simulation pitted quote unquote hacktivists or ethical hackers that were composed of Cybereason employees against a team of federal and local law enforcement officials. And there was like a referee or supervisor team called the White Team. That was Cybereason's chief security officer, Sam Curry. We'll get to him in a second because he's part of something called the National Security Institute that is full of PNAC neocons. And then the other guy was Ari Schwartz, who was a member, I believe, of the Obama administration's National Security Council advising the president. and also NIST. And he's also used to be part of the Center for Democracy and Technology, one of the main backers of Microsoft's Election Guard software. By the way, the part of DHS, it's called CISA, that's involved in guarding the election infrastructure ahead of the election, and also the power grid and all of that stuff, is a former top executive for Microsoft who has been promoting Election Guard this whole time. So, you know, Election Guard is one of those things that if something bad happens to the election infrastructure, guess who's going to come riding to the rescue? Election Guard. Anyway, story.
And as always, ask whether or not that's the plan in order to give the justification to usher in what they want to drive in. That should be like the sentiment of the decade. Everything seems to be like that right now.
I should point out that Election Guard was not just developed by Microsoft, it was also Microsoft with a contractor whose only client is the Pentagon's DARPA. So worth pointing that out. Anyway, Operation Blackout did not involve hackers targeting election software or voting machines. Instead, it involved civilian infrastructure, attacks on civilian infrastructure, or cyber attacks rather, and then psychological operations against American citizens. The hacker team in this particular exercise was led by Cybereason co-founder and former contractor for Israeli government agencies and former operative in Unit 8200. This is what he had to say about the exercise. Quote, "In a country as fragmented as the US, the number of people needed to influence an election is surprisingly small. We attempted to create havoc and show law enforcement that protecting the electoral process is much more than the machine." End quote. Wow. So this team, by the way, this whole exercise, the way they officially justified it was because of the alleged Russian meddling in 2016, which was like, you know, memes on Facebook and stuff. So keep that in mind when you see the type of stuff that this guy unleashed on this fictional city. So Stream Amit's team completely devastated the US law enforcement team in Operation Blackout, not just by causing chaos, but murdering numerous civilians. Hackers took control of city buses, ramming them into civilians waiting in line to vote at polling stations, killing 32 and injuring over 200. Remember, this was on a city level. So if you extrapolate this to a national level, certainly a much higher death count. Anyway, they also took control of city traffic lights to cause traffic accidents. They used so-called deep fakes to conduct psychological operations on the populace and created fake bomb threats posing as the terror group ISIS. They hacked telecom networks and news outlets, flooded them with deep fakes aimed at spreading disinformation and panic among US citizens.
We should note on there too that Whitney and I were talking about the relevance to the Vault 7 stuff in regard to the you know, driverless cars being abused in the situation in regard to the polls with the watchers, and you know, all the references there they made, even including deepfakes. These are all things that I'm going to go ahead and say I personally, in my opinion, guarantee are going to happen because they've been telling us they're going to happen forever. But that's interesting.
Right. Well, I laid all that out in part 3 of the Cybereason series, which we'll be doing in the next video. So more on that in a little bit. Stay tuned. So anyway, in this particular exercise, as I said earlier, there was the supervising team, which was Sam Curry of Cybereason and Ari Schwartz. And they decided that the outcome of this face-off between the hacker and law enforcement teams was the cancellation of the US 2020 election, the declaration of martial law, the growth of public fear regarding terrorism, and allegations of US government collusion with a foreign actor. As I point out here, I sort of alluded to this earlier, given how the simulation played out, it is quite clear that it is a far cry from the actual scope of alleged foreign meddling during the 2016 election, allegedly the motive behind Operation Blackout. Indeed, the extent of Russian interference in the 2016 election amounted to $100,000 worth of Facebook ads over 3 years, 25% of which were never seen by the public, and claims that Russian state actors were responsible for leaking emails from Hillary Clinton and the DNC. Of course, you know,
which is fundamentally not true, and that's been
right.
incredibly shown.
But this is the justification for this exercise, which, if you paid attention to what I just said, appears more like a terror attack targeting elections than a covert means of manipulating their outcomes, right? So it's worth pointing out that this Operation Blackout, the one that occurred last November, is hardly the only simulation Cybereason has conducted. In the weeks after that simulation last November, they repeated the same exercise in London, this time with UK intelligence and the UK Foreign Office, responsible for a lot of the disastrous foreign policy that we've seen in Syria and the war against the Syrian people since 2011, among other things, and also the Metropolitan Police of the UK. The law enforcement team in that exercise was headed by a Cybereason employee that used to work for NATO's Communications and Information Agency. Interesting. Anyway, Cybereason has been promoting extreme election day scenarios since even before the 2016 election, which is important to point out. In countering that narrative about why they did Operation Blackout, they were saying this type of extreme behavior was going to take place even before the alleged Russian meddling in 2016, right? So their first mention of these terror attack tactics on US elections appeared in a September 2016 blog post written by Lior Div, the guy that said his work at Cybereason is a continuation of his time at Unit 8200. He used to work for Amdocs.
And September would have been in the midst of election time, right? Not, they hadn't happened yet, but they would have been. So you could argue, if there's more coordination to our elections than you want to believe, that they saw this coming and this was already seeding the narrative that they knew was going to be played out all the way until today. I think that's important. I think nobody wants to realize that our elections are not as as legitimate as we'd like to believe they are, but that's something we should be asking ourselves with that kind of obvious seeding ahead of time.
Anyway, in that September 2016 blog post, Lior Div wrote that hackers may target US elections by breaking into the computers that operate traffic lighting systems, interfering with the ones around polling stations to create massive traffic jams, hacking polling companies, targeting live election coverage on cable or network television stations. And then in a follow-up post in October 2016, again before the 2016 election, he also mentioned cutting power to polling stations and, quote, messing with a voter's mind. Okay. 2 years later, Cybereason held its first election meddling simulation in Boston. This is the one where Ed Davis, the head of Boston PD during the Boston Marathon bombing, this was the one he actively participated in. What happened there, or what they simulated taking place there, Twitter accounts spreading fake news, turning off a city's closed circuit cameras, hacking self-driving cars and navigation apps, and targeting a city's 911 call center with a DDoS attack. Okay. Like the other more recent simulations, the mock election in this exercise was canceled and voter confidence in the electoral process was devastated. Then,
I'm joking. I'm saying too late. That's been devastated for a long time.
Right. So last July, Cybereason had another simulation that was before Operation Blackout, but it was also in Boston, but this time involved federal officials from FBI, DHS, and the Secret Service. So they had two simulations last year with FBI, DHS, and Secret Service. Remember, it was the FBI and DHS at that hearing that we started the video with from March of this year, warning about all of this stuff, right? So just keep that in mind, that they were working with Cybereason all last year, gaming out chaos for the 2020 election. Anyway, that simulation was very similar to the one that occurred in November. One intelligence officer from DHS who participated in the July exercise called it very realistic. Another claimed that the simulation was a way of applying lessons learned from September 11th by preventing the government's, quote, failure of imagination that officials have long alleged was the reason for the government's inability to thwart the September 11th attacks. And as I point out here, despite the claim of failure imagination, which basically boiled down to, we never expected them to fly planes into buildings or the Pentagon, among numerous other drills and exercises related to 9/11, again, story for another day. I just point out here, then less than a year before 9/11, the US military simulated terrorists flying planes into the Pentagon. So much for failure of imagination. I mean, that's just an excuse they like to roll out because they think you're stupid enough to believe it.
Exactly. The same argument they make about COVID, right? Who could have imagined this thing we've been telling you is going to happen for the last 10 years? You know, it's ridiculous.
Right. So this is from the second part of my series about Cybereason. I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. I'm just talking about their main investors, but it's worth pointing out that groups like Charles River Ventures and Spark Capital, between them, you have investments in things like Patreon, Oculus, Twitter itself, among other things, also invested in Cybereason. Worth keeping that in mind. But the ones that I focus on in this article are Lockheed Martin and SoftBank. Okay. So basically, Lockheed Martin not only markets Cybereason as part of its product portfolio, it uses it internally on all of its computers and has for years been the largest conduit of providing Cybereason software to US federal and military agencies. Let's see. What's interesting is that before they invested in Cybereason, Lockheed Martin opened an office in Beersheba, Israel, where the IDF has its cyber hub. The office was not focused on the sale of weapons, like most of what Lockheed Martin does, but instead on technology. Marilyn Hewson, Lockheed Martin's CEO, said this about her speech when that office in Beersheba was inaugurated. She said, "The consolidation of IDF technical units to new bases in the Negev Desert region is an important transformation of Israel's information technology capability. We understand the challenges of this move, which is why we are investing in the facilities and people that will ensure we are prepared to support these critical projects. By locating our new office in the capital of the Negev, we are well positioned to work closely with our Israeli partners and stand ready to accelerate project execution, reduce program risk, and share our technical expertise by training and developing in-country talent." Beersheba not only has IDF's technology campus, it also houses Israel's National Cyber Directorate, which reports directly to Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister. It's also a high-tech corporate park that mostly houses tech companies with ties to Israel's military intelligence apparatus. And, you know, right before Lockheed, this is interesting, right before Lockheed Martin opened their office there and then subsequently invest in Cybereason, Lockheed Martin was the victim of a devastating hack that was never solved. No one knows who hacked them. But what did come out is that the tokens used by whoever hacked them were tied to a company called RSA Security, which is deeply tied to Israel's defense establishment and is now owned by Dell, which is also deeply tied to Israel's government. If you didn't know that about Dell, you should really look up Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, and his extreme fervent support of Israel's government, the Likud party, among other things. And
we're all just pretending like we don't see exactly what that is, right? Like it's just plainly,
yeah.
We can't say it.
Right. So it's like, oh, you were hacked. That's so unfortunate. You know how to not be hacked anymore? Open an office and work for the IDF in Beersheba, where we've set up our new cyber hub. Anyway.
Mafia tactics, you know,
right? I must sound so conspiratorial right now. Oh, man. Anyway, the subsidiary they opened after this hack was focused on cybersecurity, enterprise information technology, data centers, mobile analytics, and the cloud, as opposed to what they normally do. And the vice president for research and technology for Lockheed Martin at the time basically admitted that they opened it so they could secure contracts and start working for the IDF. Then just a couple months after, they partner and invest in what we've already essentially laid out as a front company for Israeli military intelligence, Cybereason. And this is alarming because Lockheed Martin, of course, is one of the US government's largest private contractors. Lockheed Martin used to have an information technology division that still exists, but it was rolled into Leidos Holdings, which that merger created the largest IT provider to the US government, which remains directly partnered with Cybereason, meaning that Leidos uses Cybereason on all their computers and markets it to the US federal agencies that contract it.
God.
Wild, right?
Yeah.
So
considering the back doors into literally everything, that's pretty alarming.
So here's an example based on Tim Shorak, who's an amazing journalist. He wrote this in The Nation about what this Leidos Lockheed Martin merger that uses Cybereason, some of the roles they have for the US government. Everything from analyzing signals for the NSA to tracking down suspected enemy fighters for US Special Forces in the Middle East and Africa. The merger with Lockheed Martin resulted in this company that's using Cybereason, right, to become the largest of 5 corporations that together employ nearly 80% of the private sector employees contracted to work for US spy and surveillance agencies. Wow. Leidos, which
Wow.
again running Cybereason, runs a number of sensitive systems for the Pentagon, including the entire military telecommunications infrastructure for the Defense Information Systems Agency, or DISA. Cybereason is also partnered with the WWT, or Worldwide Technologies, and that company manages cybersecurity for the entire US Army. They maintain DISA's firewalls and data storage and the entire biometric ID system for the US Air Force, as well as contracts for NASA, which, as you mentioned, well, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier or not. I may be remembering wrong, but NASA, you can follow this link here, has been targeted by Israel's government for espionage for a long time, and also the US Navy. And, just like Leidos and Lockheed, Cybereason software completely integrated into WWT's portfolio, giving Cybereason full access to all of the devices on these highly classified networks. If you remember back to what I said a second ago, that Nocturnus security research arm of Cybereason uses all of the endpoints, right, on all of the devices Cybereason runs on to conduct its intelligence gathering. So what does that tell you? I mean, this is just, I mean, honestly, this should have been a big scandal. I wrote about this in January. No one else picked this up. Pretty wild.
Yeah.
Well, this is another interesting coincidence. Basically, you may remember that not that long ago, the US federal government banned the use of Kaspersky, which is based in Russia, I believe, antivirus products on all government computers. So the Wall Street Journal was the first to report on that, and it was eventually revealed later by the New York Times that the sole source of that allegation of Kaspersky Labs having a backdoor for Russian intelligence came from Unit 8200.
As do all of these intelligence says type of leads that we get throughout everything. I shouldn't say all of them, but a lot of these ones.
Well, it's possible that they may, yeah, because I mean, they're obfuscating the source, as they attempted to do here.
Right.
And what's crazy is that Kaspersky had previously accused Unit 8200 of trying to hack them and put backdoors for Unit 8200 and their platform. I mean, this is straight from the New York Times. Investigators later discovered that the Israeli hackers had implanted multiple backdoors into Kaspersky systems, employing sophisticated tools to steal passwords, take screenshots, and vacuum up emails and documents. Okay, so Kaspersky found the backdoors and got rid of them, and then Unit 8200 comes out and says, Kaspersky is bad, you have to get rid of it, and then the US government does that, creating a convenient void subsequently filled by Cybereason.
Right.
It's
And
almost like...
I genuinely think right now, if you think about what Russiagate and that whole narrative has done, it's seeing the kind of continuity, how long this seems to have been planned and going on. We should ask whether Russiagate in and of itself was created in order to lay the shade for this, knowing that would be pulling attention away from the real meddlers and manipulators than, if all we can scream about is $100,000 on Facebook. It's, something we should be considering. I know I'm the conspiratorial one over here. So.
Well, I think Russiagate had a lot of different purposes, and I think one of its main purposes was getting the quote-unquote U.S. left to believe whatever they see on MSNBC and CNN and whatever, which now employs people like former CIA Director John Brennan and James Clapper, another top former intelligence official who lied under oath and should be in jail for perjury. And now people just, it created this trend of reporting of quoting anonymous intelligence officials. And because of Trump derangement syndrome, there's a bunch of people in the US that, back during the Iraq invasion were raising hell, right? And now they're believing whatever US intelligence says. So, that's just one example of things that Russiagate accomplished for the establishment. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much into this, but SoftBank is really important. They're Cybereason's largest investor, responsible for $350 million out of the $400 million Cybereason had raised at the time I wrote this article. And of course, Cybereason has ties to the Trump administration. They have ties to the Kushners. They have ties to MBS of Saudi Arabia via the Vision Fund, and also Adam Newman of WeWork, who is an Israeli citizen who claimed that Jared Kushner was his mentor and that he and MBS of Saudi Arabia, together with Kushner, had created the quote-unquote peace plan for the Trump administration in the Middle East. It's also worth pointing out that the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, that we've talked about a lot before, headed by Eric Schmidt, said that SoftBank could essentially form the backbone of the global Orwellian panopticon. I mean, that's not their term for it, obviously, in their document, but that's essentially what it is, as we pointed out before. So they say SoftBank is like, the backbone of a global Internet of Things network and, you know, surveillance grid, essentially. So to just in this aspect of this report a little bit, this is an update I did to my Cyber Reason series at the end of July of this year for The Last American Vagabond, where Cyber Reason, despite already running on a bunch of government networks, as we pointed out, planned to accelerate their access to US government networks. You know, just a couple months ago, you know, ahead of the 2020 election, they predicted doomsday for. They hired this guy named Andrew Boren as managing director for its US public sector business. It launched at the same time they hired this guy. And Boren, when he was hired, said that he was going to recruit veterans and alumni of the elite US military units and agencies to work on behalf of Cyber Reason, and that they were going to market their stuff not just to the federal government, which, as we pointed out, they're already running on those networks, and so states and municipalities. Interesting. Anyway, Boren is interesting because he was a senior advisor to IARPA, which is the intelligence community's equivalent of DARPA. And he was serving in that capacity as an employee of Booz Allen Hamilton, the intelligence contractor where Edward Snowden used to work. Before that, he was Associate Deputy General Counsel for the Pentagon. He also used to be a senior executive at IBM, where he worked alongside Julian Gallina, who is currently the Chief Information Officer for the CIA. And Boren before that was, you know, a Wall Street investment banker for Wells Fargo. He's also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and as we'll get into a moment, part of the National Security Institute, which, as I point out here, includes former NSA directors Keith Alexander and Michael Hayden, the architect of the Iraq War, Paul Wolfowitz, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, among just a litany of spooks, and also Silicon Valley executives. And so Boren is not the only person for Cyber Reason that's on that National Security Institute. Sam Curry, who conducted most of these doomsday election simulations for Cyber Reason and is Cyber Reason's chief security officer, also part of the National Security Institute. So, you know, tied up with Paul Wolfowitz, that's a bad sign. Anyway, oh, sorry.
No, nothing. All these people that you're pointing out, and we're just getting started on this. What she's discovering here are all set to benefit in one way or another from the things that what we're arguing are being created, right? And there's so many of these ties that there's no way you can ignore what this is showing you unless you just decide that these people having obvious profit motives and incentivizing themselves with their own, you know, other nefarious agendas. If we can't see why that's alarming, then you're just not paying attention. I mean, there's no reason this should be justifiable. It's not in any way.
As I point out here, and I already sort of mentioned this, Robert Bigman, right, is an advisor to Cyber Reason, but another advisor to Cyber Reason that I didn't get into in my previous article in January is this guy, Peter Sherlock, who used to be chief operating officer of the MITRE Corporation, which I highly recommend people go back and watch James Corbett's excellent video called P-TECH and the 9/11 software about the involvement of P-TECH and MITRE together in essentially sabotaging the response of NORAD to hijacked airplanes on the day of 9/11. So interesting to see that connection there as well. So this is Cyber Reason's advisory board from their website. So as I've mentioned before, Robert Bigman, Pinchas Bucras of Unit 8200 and board member of APAC, Edward Davis of the Boston Police Department, but these other guys are interesting. Vice President of Security and Privacy Engineering at Google. Lockheed Martin, this guy, David Chris, is very interesting. We'll get to him in a second. You know, all these different cybersecurity people. And then here's the guy from the MITRE Corporation. Here's someone from Motorola, which of course is a major manufacturer of cell phones. So this is the National Security Institute, where you have people like, as you can see here, Paul Wolfowitz. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, here's Sam Curry of Cyber Reason, who here is Andrew Boren, who Cyber Reason just hired. And then that guy we just saw on, on Cyber Reason's board, David Chris. So who is David Chris? Interesting to see him on Cyber Reason's board for the following reasons. He's an authority on US foreign intelligence surveillance that advises the US government, including the FISA courts for warrantless spying on Americans. currently advising two anonymous elements of the U.S. intelligence community. Wow. Okay. So this is a guy that has a long history of working in intelligence and law enforcement, and you know, advising the government on foreign intelligence surveillance. And he's working for an Israeli intelligence front company, or you know, on their advisory board, which of course comes with financial benefits, right? So I mean,
we've covered the FISA court a lot in the past as well, and what it says there, the Amos Curiae is like an outside advisor to the FISA courts, which are wildly abusing your rights at every single moment, it seems. And so that's, you know, this is the guy that's on this company that has backdoors and all the information. I mean, one of many that should stand out to you as the last person that should be in this position.
And he was also a top executive at Time Warner.
Ooh.
Isn't that CNN's parent company?
I believe so. I don't want to. I'm not sure exactly, but one of the major companies that own one of the five that own everything we see.
Yeah. So you know, deep ties to mainstream media. A nice medal from the CIA, and you know, advises Cybereason. So crazy. So anyway, I don't know if you have anything you want to say before we move on. I was going to go into one specific other simulation that Cybereason did in 2018 that I think is really relevant.
No, please continue. I have some things about Carbon 911 when we get there, but please continue.
Okay. All right. So this particular simulation in 2018 is really interesting that Cybereason did. It specifically, as I mentioned earlier, used fake Twitter accounts, turned off a CCTV in a city, hacked self-driving cars, and rammed them into people, and also targeted the 911 call center. And this official who participated in the exercise said, elections are very attractive because they're at the cornerstone of our democracy. In terms of elections are attractive for an attack because they're a cornerstone of our democracy. Sounds really similar to some mainstream media talking points we've heard lately. Anyway, Ryan, are you there? I can't see you. Hello?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm still here. I guess my video was off.
Okay.
My apologies.
All right, no worries. But here's one of a Cybereason director of advisory services who was on the hacker team, the red team. And here's what she said about the goal of their manipulation of the election. So instead of manipulating the election to favor one candidate, the hackers wanted to affect voter confidence. Our goal was to get everyone to think that the election was rigged and that the results were invalid. The attackers wanted their efforts to have an impact that was felt long after people cast their ballots, said Cybereason CSO Sam Curry, who was one of the hackers. We wanted people to question the results for years. I want to point out that essentially with the 2020 election as it stands now, a scenario has been set up where either side, regardless of who wins, is going to accuse the other side of rigging the election. And mainstream media has reported on several occasions from last year and a lot more frequently, more recently, that US democracy may never recover because of the election rigging accusations that are, they're essentially admitting are inevitable. And here's Cybereason in 2018, essentially laying out, that playbook and how it would be more effective than manipulating the election to favor a particular candidate by undermining voter confidence in the entire system. So
that's a really big deal. I mean, that's incredible that the kind of foreknowledge we continue to see with COVID-19 and everything else, and then literally laying out the plan for what they're openly planning right now. And I think it's interesting to ask about the involvement of the, Biden, Trump, the administrations, and to what degree these people are part of this or puppets in this play. These are things that I think people that are really invested in the election right now are asking themselves, because this is impossible to not be tied in with government to some degree, but whether these are just, these people involved with it right now on the center stage are involved, I think that's something we're all concerned about.
So here's another article about that same simulation I was just talking about. And what do you know? The red team of Cybereason employees portraying hackers that wanted to exacerbate political divisions. Isn't that what the intelligence community is accusing Russia and China and all that stuff and Iran of doing in the US election right now? And the exact same stuff those countries are being accused of now by the same intelligence agencies tied up with Cybereason. Cybereason was simulating to do that to US elections 2 years ago. Really worth
back on the IDF thing too, that remember that they, or I believe it was, yeah, I believe it was the 8200 group, Unit 8200, were claiming that the Kaspersky group was giving back, creating back doors, and that's why they had to be removed. And it's another example of them accusing them of what exactly they were doing. And that's exactly what you see here. That's a classic tactic. It's a classic propaganda tactic, and it's been seen this whole time. They're, laying it out for us, right in clear view.
Right. Good point. So here it just says again, this focus on 911 call centers, which is important when we get into Carbine 911, and also talking about the potent weapon of disinformation to force law enforcement to divert resources. So who are the people that are really gaming out how to use disinformation to manipulate and meddle in US elections? Well, I would say look no further than Cybereason. And if people are so worried about meddling in the democracy and election season disinformation, why aren't they looking at Cybereason or the people connected to them? Why is it, the IRA troll factory in Moscow that, 25% of their stupid memes no one even saw. And some of them were like, poorly drawn Bernie Sanders in a Speedo. And then some of them were like puppy memes. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, anyway. What the group wanted to do, once again, sow doubt in the minds of people already predisposed to thinking there's tampering in the election system. What have they done in just the past few months in the United States? This playbook was set up years in advance by a front company tied to Israeli and US intelligence, period.
Right.
Which I would argue the same intelligence agencies intimately involved in September 11th.
Right. This is what our government is doing. Our media is doing. So that's clear for people that are maybe not picking up on it. We're doing that. And they're claiming that that is what the outside entities will be doing to drive into this chaos. Right. I don't see Iran doing that right now, but they're trying to paint that. Like, I think I just saw an example of what Trump's website was just recently hacked or something, and they're claiming that was Iran. And, they're trying to see that, but clearly our governments are the ones that are doing that, telling us it's going to be chaos. It's going to fall. The election's not going to work. It'll be martial law. I don't see anybody else doing that.
Right. So anyway, it's interesting. Here's a video from Cybereason about this exercise. Hopefully we have some time to listen to a bit. It's worth pointing out that the red team, the hacker team, they called themselves the Broken Eagle Task Force. Broken Eagle. Weird, eagle, like the symbol of the US government, it's on all the US presidential seals. It's like the national bird, and it's Broken Eagle Task Force. I mean, I think that's a little weird. They have a skull. It
speaks to it for sure.
It's called hacking the vote. No, this isn't Russian. Oh, by the way, Cybereason's logo might be interesting to some people that have researched, conspiracy symbolism, but I'm not going to get into that. Anyway, Ryan, let me know if you can hear the audio. If not, I will, just leave this for another day, or we can put this link in the show notes.
Go ahead.
That's Sam Curry, by the way, the guy at the National Security Institute that did all these simulations. He's talking about how he relished gaming out all of this chaos on US election stuff. The guy that's on the same little institute as Paul Wolfowitz and all these spooks, right? Because, by the way, I don't know if I showed this, but it's not just Paul Wolfowitz and stuff. You have people like Jack Keane, who's been a career operative in the U.S. military, who works for the Institute of the Study of War, run by the Kagan family, PNAC neocons, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Department. These are high-ranking spooks in here, former general counsel for the CIA. This is no joke, okay? So he's relishing this, right? Like, just keep this guy in mind.
I'm not really getting it anymore, Whitney. It's pretty low, actually. I heard it in the beginning, but now it's.
Oh, bummer.
If you want to quickly send me the link real quick, I'll put it up. I'm sure I think I can get my mic close enough so it'll hear for the video.
Can you still not hear it?
Not enough for
Okay.
they won't be able to hear it in the show because my mic's gonna have to pick it up. So just shoot me a link real quick on Signal and I'll bring it up.
Okay. You can't see Signal on my screen, right?
No.
All right, good. Okay, I had it at like 11 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, here we go. 1 second while it opens. Okay. So you said 11 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. See if it's loud enough.
The team and
Yeah, that should be
Mhm.
good. Okay. All right. You let me know when you want me to stop.
Yeah.
as an interesting side note, the red team, except for myself, was entirely women who were from education, from public service, and hacking backgrounds, which was an interesting dynamic. But the team, we decided at the beginning of the day that we were going to try and think about when people go to the polls. The activity took place over the course of really 4 turns, and Ross may say more on that in a moment. But from a preparatory turn, and then the day was divided up into four different time zones. And there was some other context as well. There was, for instance, a political rally happening in one district, or a United Nations type of event. And there was also a couple of crime-heavy sectors in the southern part of the city. So what we thought was, if that people would vote, in particular early in the day and late in the day. And we knew that we had the ability to develop new assets. Every turn, we could take 2 actions and develop future assets. And so what we wanted to do was try to get people to not be able to vote in the morning due to scares, and then we'd have a lull in the middle of the day. And then later in the day to try to really play our hand with heavily to either shut the polls down or prevent people from being able to exercise their franchise. Now, the political motivation for us is we were hacktivists, and we are unhappy with the way democracy is playing out, and so we want to discredit the system. And it's interesting, at the beginning of the day, we thought that meant do as much harm as possible. But later in the day, our mission became more laser focused. As the turns played out, we realized that our job wasn't to actually get it so bad that the election would be called off, because then it could just call it another day. Instead, what we decided to do was try to make the result of the election be as in doubt and as politically biased as possible. So the map that Ross just showed became very important to us. What we wanted to do was make sure that those that were in disenfranchised or poorer areas, or those that were leaning to the left, would be seen to be biased against the current governor of Nolandia, who was more on the right. And so at the beginning of the day, we played a few cards, but we spent most of the middle of the day developing, and then finally hitting hard later in the day. And the
You
name
can
of
stop it there.
is information.
I mean, this goes on a while, but what I want to point out, this is going to be really important when we get into the next video we're going to do specifically about Philadelphia. But what they're saying there, specifically targeting minority areas or areas associated with the left and pitting them against a right-wing governor. That sounds a lot like Pennsylvania right now, if you've been paying attention to the situation as it's been developing in Philadelphia. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, and very honestly disconcerting to see these guys game this out. And also the fact that they admit that, like, creating this type of chaos and like upending US democracy, that they relish the opportunity to do this. I mean, it's just in light of all the other connections that we've gone over, I mean, it's just honestly unnerving in a big way. But I mean, you know, here they are looking specifically to how to undermine confidence in the democratic system, you know, and doing all of the things that we're being told that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea or whatever are doing. And here it is, Cybereason. And also keep in mind too, as I showed earlier, Cybereason is one of the companies setting this narrative that these hacks and this misinformation, alleged misinformation going on in relation to the election, of all of that, they're the ones assigning blame to those same state actors being blamed right now. But look who was gaming this out publicly with US officials, who are now warning that this very threat is going to take place. You know, I mean, it's just absolutely 100% outrageous. And I want to point out here, if you just look at that slide there, look at this narrative control. That was one of their objectives, right? False information, narrative control. So, you know, I think, you know, on election day, when we get more into the nuts and bolts of what's likely to transpire in and around the US election this year, you know, the role of deep fakes, misinformation on social media, how Facebook and Twitter have already said that they're going to manipulate people's news feeds on those two sites to a huge degree, and use a toolkit that's normally used in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, not during elections, but during extreme events of political unrest. I mean, you know, we really need to keep this stuff in mind.
And you pointed out when you're going over the other articles that there's a funding tie between Twitter and Cybereason, right? That was one of the groups that you
well, there's a venture capital firm that backs that has invested in both of them. Yes.
Right. Okay. It's interesting. Now, so what we're looking at here, what did the red team do? And they're claiming controlling the narrative is what the bad guy is going to be trying to accomplish. That's what we're saying on the slide, right? Again, it's just so funny how we're very clearly see that's what they're doing, as you're pointing out. And it's just, I don't see anybody else doing it. That's interesting. Can we keep going?
Yeah. No, because otherwise, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff they get into, but I just wanted to point out that part about the focus on minorities, pitting them off against the, you know, a right-wing governor and exacerbating that political divide. And that is honestly very similar to the situation that allegedly, per local media in Philadelphia and also on national news regarding Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and also other blue pockets in Pennsylvania had been setting up this exact narrative. And we've also seen, you know, like the 911 call center outage that was also in this same simulation of Cybereason also being seeded very heavily. And then you had that big outage in 911 call centers last month, right? So, I mean, definitely disconcerting. But anyway, as I already was here, I was just gonna go into the board of Carbine 911 as it is now. So if you followed the Epstein case, you may remember how the Carbine 911 board used to look. Its board of directors included Ehud Barak, who, of course, because of the Epstein scandal and the fact that he raped minors, is no longer there. Neither is Nicole Junkerman, who Johnny Vedmore has probably exposed more than anyone else, her ties to Epstein and Israeli intelligence. And then we have Pinchas Bucharest, who, of course, is now advising Cybereason. This guy has ties to a Trump, I believe the Trump re-election campaign, a New York real estate developer named Elliot Tawil. He's not there anymore either. And we used to have just, you know, Michael Chertoff, the former head of DHS, whose mom used to work for Mossad and, you know, had some cover-up role, had some major cover-up role in September 11th. And, you know, you just look at a pretty small advisory board, right? Not that many people. Well, look at it now. This is what it looks like now. They've added the most recent head of DHS before acting DHS Secretary Chad Wolf, Christian Nielsen, is now here. Michael Chertoff remains there. But look who else they've added. Former Assistant Director for Intelligence at the FBI, the same group entrapping and creating and manufacturing a new domestic terror threat that's allegedly going to create the next 9/11 imminently. A former director for FEMA, who, if you look at the time frame, he was director of FEMA working directly under Michael Chertoff. Edward Davis, who, of course, we pointed out earlier, intimately involved with Cybereason and their election doomsday simulations, which included 911 call center outages, something that Carbine 911 is set to profit from immensely. Also, the former head of Los Angeles Police Department. And then this guy, by the way, Trey Stevens, used to work for Palantir and is a partner at the Founders Fund, which is Peter Thiel's venture capital arm, which of course invested in Carbine 911. And Palantir, if you haven't heard me talk about them recently, you know, they were funded with CIA In-Q-Tel money. Their only client for the first 3 years of their existence as a company was the CIA. They have continued ties to the U.S. intelligence community, now a contractor for all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, and intimately involved in coronavirus response, contact tracing, all of these things. So it's really interesting to see all of this come together here. Carbine's partners now include Google, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, Cisco, which is probably one of the biggest companies set to, you know, be the backbone, I guess you could say, of smart cities in the U.S.
Also gigantic in regard to distribution and all kinds of different things.
Right.
That seem to apply to COVID-19 specifically.
Right. And then we have Mark 43 that we've talked about before, and I wrote about recently in relation to my expose on Ashton Kutcher's charity, quote unquote charity called Thorn. Mark 43 is backed by Jeff Bezos of Amazon and General David Petraeus, a former CIA director with deep and long-standing ties to the Kagan family. Again, Kagan family being key operatives around the events of September 11th and intimately involved in the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC, that a year before 9/11 called for, said that a new Pearl Harbor was necessary to usher in all the stuff they wanted to do in the document that came out 1 year before 9/11, Rebuilding America's Defenses. So Mark 43 is basically a high-tech thing for law enforcement. They're saying because of the, now anyway, they're making a sales pitch because of the unrest in the United States that has been going on all summer, that it will increase police ability to respond and improve police response and make it easier on them because of increased unrest. And they're directly partnered with Carbine. So former CIA director, Carbine, Unit 8200. I mean, what we're having here is just essentially what I've called before in reports on this, really emerging of the US and Israeli national security states to a huge degree. And if you look at the investments of people like Google's Eric Schmidt and Unit 8200's Team 8 cyber or tech company incubator, or Microsoft's ties to Unit 8200, or perhaps Bill Gates' ties to Ghislaine's sister, Isabel Maxwell, that I've also written about, among other things. It starts to become pretty obvious what's going on there. Oh, also Jeff Bezos' close friendship with Ghislaine Maxwell that Ghislaine used to brag about, worth pointing all this stuff out.
Indeed.
Especially considering, again, if in case you forgot, I said earlier on in the show, Carbine received an investment directly from Jeffrey Epstein, and lots of Epstein associates were on its board originally until the scandal broke, and they wanted to save face, so they took them off, right? So Carbine, it turns out, just 1 week after the election, is going to have a global innovation summit to talk about how great Carbine 911 is and how people need to use it for whatever reason. So if there is an event on election day, wow, this will be an interesting thing to watch. But look who their keynote speaker is. The former Navy SEAL Team 6 leader who claims to have killed Osama bin Laden has been caught totally lying, and his book is 100% made up. Okay, he's the keynote speaker. Good choice, guys. And then you have, the head of Cyberease and the Unit 8200 guy, Amir Elichai. Christian Nielsen, all these people from the board, this Mexican ex-head of National Public Safety in Mexico. These people from the board we already talked about. You also have this lady from different police departments. The New Orleans guy in charge of Carbine 911 that's running in the city of New Orleans right now. But Carbine 911 has been implemented in various counties around the US. I just want to point that out. And then there's a guy from Amazon Web Services here. They're justice and public safety leader for Amazon. Sounds like a fun time, Carbine's upcoming Global Innovation Summit. So I've talked a lot about the people tied into Carbine. So really quick, this is from an article I did for Mint Press News. That was a, I'll just go up and show you, a spin-off of my Epstein series called How the CIA, Mossad, and the Epstein Network Are Exploiting Mass Shootings to Create an Orwellian Nightmare. Yes, Carbine 911 attempted to market themselves as the solution, the pre-crime solution to mass shootings, stopping mass shooters before they happen. Now, as we'll see in a moment, they have pivoted to stopping COVID-19 outbreaks before they happen, is now
medical pre-crime, right?
Yeah, just, like I've said before, they're tacking on, their selling point is, they're tacking it to whatever people are most afraid of at a given time in order to sell it. So what do you know? Anyway, not long after Carbine 911 was founded in 2014 by veterans of Israeli military intelligence, Carbine began to be specifically marketed as a solution to mass shootings in the US that goes beyond the gun debate and improves the intelligence that armed emergency responders receive before entering an armed shooter situation. Prior to Epstein's arrest last July, Carbine received lots of praise from US and Israeli media. Fox News praised it as the answer to the US's aging 911 systems, and the Jerusalem Post said that the company offers high-tech protection to social workers and school principals. Carbine also at that time was marketing their platform for non-emergency calls to governments, educational institutions, and corporations. Clearly they have ambitions far beyond the 911 call center. By the way, the main group in Congress lobbying for next generation 911 systems, of which Carbine is one example, that main lobby group pushing for a national next generation 911 system that's called the National Emergency Number Association, has a strong relationship with Carbine. So I wonder who they'll choose or recommend to Congress. Anyway, Carbine's current CEO, it's still their CEO, Amer Elachai, served in Unit 8200 and tapped former Unit 8200 commander. And at the time I wrote this article, he was a current board member of APAC. I don't know if he still is. I'll have to look that up. But he was the company's director and on its board. He has since been removed and he was added later to Cyber Reasons board. In addition to Elachai, another Carbine co-founder who's mentioned, you can't find her name anywhere on Carbine's website anymore either. But she was a co-founder of the company, Lital Lashim, also served in Unit 8200 and worked for Black Cube. Now she works for Eric Prince's Frontier Services Group in China. So
Jeez.
good
Black
times.
Black Rock, Black, everything. I mean, it's
Blackwater is Eric
good
Prince,
Lord.
right? So
I don't understand why there's so many entities here that are clearly tied. I mean, look, why are Americans okay with any foreign entity having this many ties to all these different groups supposedly separate that are about protecting our election infrastructure? Like, I mean, I think we should be alarmed if this was France that had this much control over our election. Anybody, right? Russia's all we hear. I mean, it's just every other person you mention, if not all of them, are either former Unit 8200 or former IDF or former this. It's just, I mean, I'm almost getting angry as we go through this because of how obvious this is. It's frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, it is pretty obvious, but it's worth pointing out Carbine 911 has no direct association with election infrastructure, but it is part of critical infrastructure, public safety response, emergency first response. And as we'll be showing, I don't know if you have stuff queued up on this for today, but if not, we'll be showing it tomorrow, just how much mainstream media has promoted the idea that these coming cyber attacks, either on or shortly after the US election, are going to target critical infrastructure that includes 911 call centers. I mean, it's really out of control. So anyway, the only co-founder of Carbine 911, there were three, right? There's the third one, didn't serve in Unit 8200, but he, before founding Carbine, worked for Israel's Prime Minister's office, Benjamin Netanyahu, once again. So anyway, this is probably, the most crucial part to understand about Carbine and what it really is and why these people want it, why it was being backed by people like Peter Thiel and people like Ehud Barak and people like Jeffrey Epstein. Okay. Privacy concerns with Carbine go beyond the company's ties to Israeli intelligence and US intelligence contractors like Peter Thiel, who, as I mentioned earlier, invested a lot of money in Carbine 911. For instance, Carbine's smartphone app extracts the following information from the phones on which it is installed: device location, video live stream from the smartphone to the call center, text messages in a two-way chat window, any data from a user's phone if they have the Carbine app in this other part of the Carbine system, and any information that comes over a data link, which Carbine opens in case the caller's voice link drops out. According to Carbine's website, this same information can also be obtained from any smartphone, even if it does not have Carbine's app installed, if that phone calls a 911 call center that uses Carbine or merely any other number connected to Carbine's network. Wow.
Yeah.
This is, don't worry though, it gets worse.
It's only about 911 calls though. That's it. Don't look any further, right?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, right, they were marketing this also to non-emergency calls for corporations, schools, and things like that. Anyway,
just to get their foot in the door kind of scenario.
Yes, exactly. Carbine sells themselves, as I mentioned a second ago, as a next generation 911 platform. The explicit goal of that is for all 911 systems nationwide to become interconnected. Thus, even if Carbine is not used by all 911 call centers using an NG 911 platform, Carbine will ostensibly have access to the data used by all emergency service providers and devices connected to those networks. Woohoo. All right, anyway. This is the worst part probably of the whole thing. Carbine's platform has pre-crime elements such as its C records component, which stores and analyzes information on past calls and events that pass through its network. This information, quote, enables decision makers to accurately analyze the past and present behavior of their callers, react accordingly, and in time, predict future patterns.
So callers, meaning you're calling to report somebody else committing a crime, and they immediately start tracking you and wondering whether you're their next person.
And analyzing your behavior based on your past behavior, because they extract all the data off of your phone, right? and they use that to predict future patterns about crime in emergencies. And I think I note in this article, Carbine 911 has openly stated the goal of their platform is so that eventually at some point in the future, people won't even have to make 911 calls themselves. Smart devices and smart cities like a street light or something like that, because of this algorithm they're developing that predicts future patterns, will make emergency 911 calls for you. Convenience, I'm sure, is how they'll sell that, but just think about the Orwellian consequences of something of a system like that. And as I point out here, because this was all before coronavirus and in the context of mass shootings, concerns have recently been raised that pre-crime technology may soon become more widely adopted in the US. By the way, a month after I wrote this article, Bill Barr announced pre-crime and that it was going to be implemented at the end of 2020. It's called DEEP. You should go look it up. They've been piloting it in cities all year across the US. Anyway,
Well,
mhm.
I'm sorry, I thought you jumped with the paragraph. I was just going to add that what they're talking, basically this is very clear on the face of this, that we are all potential criminals, right? That's the thing that really stood out to me there, is that even though you're calling in to be like, help me, someone's attacking me, you are suddenly then categorized and tracked, and as you said, to predict what future crimes may happen, which just means
Right.
we're all potential criminals to this algorithm, which is really crazy to think about how they
But
frame it.
what's important here is that people have forgotten this. Last year, President Trump said his planned solution to the mass shootings that happened last year was for big tech companies to detect potential shooters before they strike. So imagine those DHS guys that we saw this March making those predictions. If there's another 9/11 style event like that, what do you think Trump will say? Oh, we have to stop those anti-Semitic domestic terrorists before they can strike, right? And it's worth pointing out, I didn't really drive this home when we were talking about the people connected to Carbine 911. Peter Thiel, intimately tied to Trump's administration, particularly his transition team, a lot of prominent people in the Trump administration chosen and put there by Peter Thiel, right? As I mentioned previously, there was Elliot Tawil, who was at the time a major Trump donor on the board of Carbine 911. Now they currently have big name Trump appointees like Christian Nielsen, former head of DHS under Trump, on Carbine's board. Who do you think they'll choose, especially if 911 call centers are taken down and they need a 911 solution and a pre-crime solution all in one? What do you know? It's just like it's waiting there to come in and save the day from this 9/11 event that we are allegedly on the doorstep of.
And I know this is what we're going to be touching on in the next video, but the idea that what you just simply to bring it to in mind of COVID-19 is all it needs to then be is that attack that they're saying they're stopping just has to involve some kind of biological aspect. Then suddenly you've got medical pre-crime, you've got regular pre-crime, you've got all these things set. And that's how I keep seeing this image. All of this is tied together very clearly.
Well, it's no coincidence that since coronavirus has come on the scene, Carbine 911 has conveniently pivoted to also market their platform as a key way to not, before it was prevent mass shootings before they happen. Now it's to prevent COVID-19 outbreaks before they happen. Notice how quick that pivot was for them.
Or terrorists too. Just depends on the day,
Right, exactly. So anyway, New Orleans, which I mentioned earlier, has been running Carbine 911 ever since their predictive policing program with Palantir, also funded by Peter Thiel, ended. Here comes Carbine 911 to do the same crap in New Orleans. Anyway, starting on March 16th, 2020, not long after that DHS testimony we started the show with, emergency responders in the city of New Orleans are adapting to the new normal amidst the coronavirus pandemic by testing out Carbine. It talks about the ties to Peter Thiel, Ehud Barak, and even Jeffrey Epstein. But here's an interesting admission of theirs. Carbine relies on callers submitting themselves to self-surveillance via their own mobile phone. There it is. That's exactly what Carbine 911 is for. It is a surveillance and pre-crime system based on what you access on your phone, including what you say on social media, all of that stuff it sucks up. Okay. And it's no coincidence, by the way, that they were pitching this, we're Carbine 911 and we're going to stop mass shooters before they strike. And then another Trump administration proposed solution proposed by Kushner and Ivanka was to go through people's social media history and create a health equivalent of DARPA called HARPA that was going to examine people's social media history for instances of mentally ill or mental illness and all this stuff, and that was how they were going to stop mass shooters, right? So get ready. Anyway, as I mentioned a little earlier, but with the, the coronavirus flavor, once permitted, Carbine can not only get more accurate location information directly from a phone, but also see the caller's surroundings. In the age of coronavirus, Carbine says that people will be able to get remote screening and be more easily located for testing or treatment. Plus, it will also help first responders identify situations where they'll be at high risk of contagion.
Just real quick, since you mentioned it, here's just a quick example of a long, dark winter. Experts worry about mental health in the first COVID-19. So it's not just about the other things, it's also mental health too. Long, dark winter, however they want to spin it. That just seemed relevant to what you were saying.
Right. So anyway, this article has some new information that I didn't even know about Carbine 911 when I wrote about them last year. For example, there used to be, but no longer, a commissioner for the Met Police in the UK, which, by the way, also, as I mentioned earlier, the Met Police, along with British intelligence, did their own simulations with Cybereason, okay? But an original vice president was this guy who, what do you know, tied up with NSO Group, the same people responsible for hacking WhatsApp to surveil human rights activists that Saudi Arabia didn't like, among other scandals. So this is also a very interesting admission. So Forbes asked Carbine about Epstein. Remember, as I pointed out earlier, Carbine 911, after the Epstein scandal, took out everyone that could have been linked to Epstein. They took out Nicole Junkerman. They took out Ehud Barak, who was a major investor in the company, and it was its director and chairman of its board. They clearly cleaned house. They also took out Pinchas Bucharest because of his ties to Unit 8200. I guess they want to make it look less like an Israeli intelligence front and more American by adding DHS people, right?
Right. Just why would you want to hide that? I mean, I think that's an obvious example.
But I mean, that's what they did. I mean, look at the changes to their advisory board. They added a guy from LAPD, a guy from the FBI, the former head of DHS. I mean, all of these people from the US government, and they took out the Unit 8200 Epstein people. Yeah. And they're like, don't worry, we love America now. Okay, whatever. So anyway, what's interesting here is that previously last year, Ehud Barak, when he was pressed about Carbine 911's the investment it had received from Epstein, said that Epstein's the stake of Epstein's estate in that company had been eliminated. Okay, here's the head of the CEO and co-founder of Carbine 911 saying this year in March that Epstein's estate still has a 5% stake in the company. And by the way, this company is valued at like a ton of money, hundreds of millions. I mean, like a big company. So that's definitely not a small passive investment, as they like to claim. I mean, it's wild. So, we've already caught Carbine 911 in a lie trying to cover up their Epstein ties. They're clearly unsettled by that connection, and But I just want to end with this one quote here from the CEO of Carbine 911 itself. He says, Carbine is going to be a unicorn in the new public safety monster. This is what we're trying to build here. Public safety monster. Interesting choice of words. Yes. And as you can see here, Carbine now has a feature on their site about preventing COVID-19 reemergence, all ready to go right before the alleged second wave and the darkest winter will come. How convenient.
Ask yourself how you think that even functions. If this is a 911 call center, how in the world would it stop you from, or even prevent, it's because it's tracking you and what's going on around you, and it's in conjunction with all the other things we're seeing. That's the only way that makes sense. Right, not just like Whitney was saying, this 911 aspect is just a cover for where the real direction is.
Yes, now they've added a COVID-19 questionnaire to their platform, and pre-crime and whatever. I mean, just really, really wild. But here are some examples. New Orleans, again, as I mentioned, they're used in Israel, Mexico, and 7 countries around the world, which includes where I live in Chile. A lot of Latin American countries. Latin America has really been one of their main focuses for expansion. And it's interesting. So this preventing COVID-19 reemergence on Carbine's website is really recent. But back in March, in April, I think I was looking at their website for the book I'm writing on Epstein, and they had a section about remote government, how when the US government, because of the coronavirus crisis and all of this, was moving to teleworking, telemeetings, all these Zoom and all this stuff, that they were offering their platform specifically to the various US government agencies. And that part of their site in English has been taken down, but they have left up the Spanish version. But you can see here that it's still titled Remote Government in English, but this is what Remote Government says in Spanish. And you can see here that originally it was clearly in English because all the graphics are in English, and just this was like automatically translated into Spanish. And you can see here that it was backed by Microsoft and Amazon. And we can use our passports with Carbyne 911 and give them pictures of our ID numbers and all this stuff. And it was targeting these specific government agencies. I'll just translate it since, whatever. So this was for the DMV originally. This was taxes like the IRS, customs, or in the US it was Customs and Border Patrol on the original site in English, Social Security, and the court system. Carbyne 911 was trying to run all of that for the US government not that long ago.
It just seems like a real lazy effort to we'll just kind of translate, make it Spanish and leave all the English notes in there. What it screams to me, and this is the kind of thing I see across the board with the government manipulations, that they apply these things to the lowest common denominator. All they need is that average level of people that don't really want to research. They just want to check and go, oh yeah, it's not there. That is the person they're aiming that at. And so as long as they have that certain percentage that they think they can get away with these things, and that's what it seems to me. But here, to end here, a couple things I wanted to share on that note that what Whitney was talking about here. Let's see, let me get the right screen. I believe it's this one. There we go. So we're talking about the 911 outages and the tie-in with the area we're referencing, Pennsylvania. This is something we've already referenced that I did a show on as well. Hackers taking down dozens of 911 centers. Why is it so hard to stop them? Well, here's another one.
It can't be stopped. It's inevitable. I mean, that's what
right.
The mainstream narrative has kind of been seeding about all of this, right?
Right. There's nothing we can do except rely on a foreign country's surveillance to make that work for us. But it says, who's behind Monday's 14-state 911 outage? It says emergency 911 systems were down for more than an hour on Monday in towns and cities across 14 states. The outages led many news outlets to speculate the problem was related to Microsoft Azure Web Service. But of course, to make sure that that's not the case, it says two companies, it says, however, multiple sources tell this website that the 9/11 issue stemmed from some kind of technical snafu involving the companies that together handle all of the 911 call broad swaths across the United States. So the point is that it's the whole system, as you were saying, and that's what every outlet you'll find will basically be parroting, the same idea. On the afternoon of Monday, September 28th, several states, including, and I just thought it was interesting to list what you said, Arizona, California, Colorado, Delaware, Florida, Illinois. I mean, this is, they wanted to be all encompassing across the country.
Yeah. Do you notice how many swing states are in there that got hit by that outage? Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Interesting.
Very relevant. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it says, quote, we've seen no indication that the multi-state 911 outage was a result of Microsoft, essentially.
Trust us. We're Microsoft.
Yeah, exactly.
Bill Gates founded us. We never lie. It's just our two co-founders had deep ties to Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Isabel Maxwell, and hung out with Jeffrey Epstein on an elite social networking site. Let's forget about that.
Nothing to see here. 911 outages have become a fact of life. Are we?
Fact of life.
Right.
Wow.
See how they're framing it. Are we even going to fix this? Right? Like, this is how they try. Like, no one's doing anything. It says because we still don't know what caused yesterday's 911 outage, and it's not clear anything would change, even if we knew. It's like we have no idea what we could possibly do, and that's just so ridiculous because there's so many different things that could be applied. Maybe just doing this from an internal level as opposed to reaching out to another. It seems obviously they're trying to float this thing. It says police departments and public safety agencies across the country had to hand out alternative numbers to call. So how do they know? I mean, that seems odd to me, but it says in some cases, warn residents not to dial 911 just to test if the systems had started working again. The point is that how do people even know that this was happening? The only people that would know that was happening is the people that would have tried to call in that moment and didn't get through. The reason people knew and were trying to call to test it is because they told everybody, we're in danger, 911's down. Like it's about creating the narrative.
They announced it on Twitter, right? They all announced,
right.
Our 911 systems are down and all of this stuff. Yeah, I mean, they definitely made a public push about it for sure.
Which leads to this thing, which I think is the most important part of what I'm showing you here. And this is from Carbyne. And it's important. It's from February 12th, 2019, right? So way before all of this. And they're saying 5 ways 911 and emergency services will advance this year. And it's saying that although 911 has remained largely the same for the past 50 years, there was progress in 2018. This trend will accelerate in 2019, which again, how do they know where this is going? 2019 and 2020 is where we saw all of this being justified, right? And it says a new wave of innovation that will enhance emergency response throughout the country. What, you mean like what we see because of COVID-19? It's an interesting thing to think about there.
Well, I mean, they're tied to contractors for the U.S. government and Silicon Valley behemoths, very involved in what's been going on over recent months and years. As we pointed out a second ago, partnered with Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, all of which double as U.S. government, mainly U.S. national security state contractors. So yeah, I mean, maybe they knew. Plus, all their ties now that they have to DHS, the same agency warning that all these things are going to be hacked. And also remember, DHS is CISA, run by a former top executive for Microsoft. Microsoft's partnered with Carbyne 911. He's in charge on behalf of DHS of protecting all of the critical infrastructure in the US. That includes 911 call centers and election infrastructure, among other things. Well, so outrageous, right?
Yes.
Conflict of interest, very alarming, because he's that same agency that's been warning this stuff's going to get hacked, and his former employer has a conflict of interest in wanting those systems to be attacked, so the new systems that Microsoft, among other companies, are tied to can come in and ride to the rescue.
Right.
When they normally would not be accepted by the American public because they're creepy pre-crime surveillance dragnets. So
it's just so many conflicts of interest and profit motives for, nefarious ones, like things where you could argue that it would make sense for them to allow it to happen because they're going to wildly profit. All the groups you listed, this whole thing, they're tied through this all. But to go through the points they're mentioning here, number one, adopting mobile location. And Whitney touched on this a bit in her article. Harnessing GPS and Wi-Fi chip data, the feature enables emergency dispatchers to determine a caller's exact location. Mm-hmm. And as Whitney mentioned in the article, this can be happening even if you're not intending to call Carbyne 911 centers. They can just grab that data just because you're calling a 911 center in general.
Or any number. Remember, they're marketing themselves to corporations and schools and all this stuff. Any number connected to Carbyne 911's network that doesn't necessarily have to be the 911 call center. They can take all your data.
And as you say that too, think about that. That's almost a guarantee to make sure that it just very quickly becomes everywhere. Right, because it just continues to expand because you just have this tangential connection, and then that one's there, and then that one's there, and it's it kind of seems like the contact tracing analogy where they're doing it just to make sure you're safe, but they contact trace you, and then they contact trace them, and then the people that were next to them, and it just a year later everyone's contact traced, right? That kind of seems like the same analogy. Number two, mobile technologies enhance 911 operations. Mobile users of 911 can also provide 911 call centers with real-time video streaming. Now, I found that to be interesting, because what they're arguing is that, instead of giving you a verbal, you can just kind of show what's happening. But if they're able to, as we're going to get into next, and as you kind of noted, have some kind of weird of able to access information on your phone or possibly do something on your phone as your next.
Once you call 911 and give them access to your camera, you can't turn that off.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
They can turn it on whenever. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so now suddenly we have this, in security gap where your phone video streaming is potentially, just because you're using the system. Embracing cloud reliability, it says, and this made me think of your AI discussion with legacy systems, and they call it a legacy 911 system.
Yes. This is one of the legacy systems that the National Security Commission on AI wants to replace. Remember that National Security Commission, headed by Eric Schmidt of Google, and it has Microsoft, it has Amazon, partners of Carbyne 911. They say these are legacy systems that need to be replaced. And they're in there, those Silicon Valley companies partner with Carbyne 911. On that, also on that commission, you have the CIA, you have the other parts of the intelligence community, and you have the Pentagon, right, which contract with those same Silicon Valley companies. And as we pointed out, you have Cyber Reason, essentially with a back door into the Pentagon systems. This is in ties to the CIA and U.S. intelligence at Cyber Reason and all of this stuff. Also DHS, right? All over Carbyne 911's board now. That's a domestic intelligence agency, as is the FBI. And now they have the former head of intelligence for the FBI on their board too. Ah, man. I mean, it's just like so obvious. I don't
It
know.
really is. That's while you were going over it earlier, I was literally just going like, damn it. Like, like it was just, I can't believe this is so
Well,
clear.
you know, people that want to watch this video and call me a conspiracy theorist after laying all this stuff out, you know, I mean, these are red flags. You know, the idea is to report the red flags before they result in something awful happening.
Right.
So, you know, I'm not here trying to fearmonger. I'm pointing out, you know, we are pointing out real facts that are very concerning, especially what this same domestic intelligence agency tied to Carbine 911 and some of these other groups that we've been talking about warned in March, partnered with the ADL, right, that there's going to be, we're right on the doorstep of another 9/11. I mean, that should freak people out. I mean, people should start paying attention to this stuff. It's
Absolutely.
real.
The
And stop
best,
smearing us as conspiracy theorists.
it's
You know?
never going to stop. That's coming from the same people we're trying to expose. That's why I'm a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
But the point here though is that all of this stuff. I mean, it's every single there. If you were to remove, let's say, Israel's government from the discussion, or remove the U.S. government, or remove us, just remove all of the names and faces and connections, and just made this about any detective or researcher with different people, these connections are a no-brainer. I mean, this is surface level evidence, right? It's not facts just yet in regard to proving people with their intentions and all that. There's plenty of facts, by the way. I just mean in a general sense. If you were researching this as a detective, with not in regard to elections and countries, this would be an obvious path you would take. There'd be a no-brainer. You would immediately go to the person who has all the connections and all the profit motives, who benefits. But yeah, we're crazy. You know, it's just that's an easy way to get people to not look at stuff that's real.
The only way you're not a conspiracy theorist is if you blame Russia and Iran and China.
Right. In the same exact context, though. That's what makes perfect sense, right?
Oh man, yeah. Oh man, you got to scroll down to number 4. That one is pretty
right. Yeah, these are all
wearable reference. Mm-hmm.
But what it says is necessary reliance to serve civilians citizens in the face of natural disasters, which, you know, I mean, you could argue that could play in a lot of different ways, but moving to the cloud was what stood out to me, because I find that whole thing today with the cloud to be wildly, like, that does not feel safe to me, especially knowing who controls those things.
Well, I mean, the cloud that Carbine uses, as we pointed out, right? Yeah. Amazon Web Services, exactly. Amazon's cloud. That is the cloud also used by Cybereason, and it's also the cloud used by most of the U.S. government at this point in time, and it's all owned by Jeff Bezos, world's richest man, who used to hang out with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. So, you know, he's a great guy. Anyway, go on.
And as you pointed out, Amazon's tied in with almost every single thing we're talking about here.
Right.
In regard to COVID and all of this. So it's just obvious. But yes, the Internet of Emergency, which is tied to Internet of Things discussion. It says that Internet of Things devices, including wearables, which Derek and I were just talking about, is just a segue, a foot in the door again into more invasive stuff, as Moncef Slaoui and Hepburn and all of them talked about.
It's part of Operation Warp Speed. It's either going to be wearable or it's going to be Profusa, for the pharmacovigilance surveillance system, as they call it. So,
and the Profusa is injectable, which they call minimally invasive, which is just ridiculous. But it says, and Internet of Things enabled cars, which we just mentioned, is also right. They kept using those cars to crash into booths.
That's the car. Yeah, that's the car that Cybereason, the type of car Cybereason predicted would be rammed and hacked into people voting and would be used to kill a bunch of civilians.
Yep. And it says, are being developed to contact emergency services automatically and transmit vital data to dispatchers. Contact services automatically. So again, some things are being taken out of your hands. Connected cars, which you could argue may have positive effects but there's also ways that could be abused. That's the only thing we're mentioning here. Not that these things couldn't be used for positive things also. It says connected cars will also be critical to ushering in the next gen 911. New car models in the European Union are required to be equipped with eCall, which is the new kind of a feature like OnStar that's tied in with this whole thing. So now your car has a potential security risk here. So it just seems all encompassing.
By the way, one of the main guys tied up with eCall, who's a UK based, I think he's British. He's on Carbine 911's board as well.
Of course. I could have guessed that.
Why would he not be? I mean, come on, we're living in clown world, so it should be obvious, right? Oh man. All right.
Now it just says that automatically calls emergency services in the event of an accident.
Right.
So, that you could argue that would be a good thing, but then what if it, accidentally thinks you're in an accident and you're really not, and it calls, and it's like there's so many ways this could be easily abused and just tapped into.
Well, yeah. Well, it's like what I said earlier. The end game that Carbine 911 admits is the eventual goal of their system is to have Internet of Things connected devices make 911 call centers for you.
Right.
And remember, Amazon's wearable, talking about wearables, now detects, can now determine your emotions based on your tone of voice and be like, oh, you sound depressed today. Perhaps we should call the authorities, right? I mean,
Welfare check. Yeah.
I mean, yikes, dude. I mean, this is really like even beyond Orwell at this point, for real.
Totally.
Mhm.
And it goes on, it says the Internet of Things won't only help accelerate emergency response for people on the go, which there shouldn't be a period there. Smart homes equipped with connected devices like light sensors, smart speakers, and smoke detectors will be able to connect with 911 in an unfolding emergency, like you were referencing, a fire, a home invasion, or a health-related episode.
Health-related
That
health.
seems
Physical
relevant.
or mental health.
Right. And it says, for example, new startups are working to make this a reality, right? So all those new startups, public-private partnerships, and all this, that's how it's all going. Now, number 5, which is the last one, promoting dispatchers' well-being. Now, I found this to be really interesting. You tell me what you feel from this. It says the need for enhanced measures to promote their well-being for the people actually receiving the 911 calls, because they're arguing that they hear them and they get, emotionally distraught. And maybe that's the case.
I'm pretty sure that is the case. And there are 911 call centers around the country that aren't affiliated with Carbine 911 that have been trying to add like behavioral psychologists to combat that problem for whatever reason. But I think the reason Carbine 911 includes that is because they add video streams to their calls. So now the 911 call people aren't just hearing the emergency, they're forced to see the emergency. So if it's like a graphic murder or something like that, now they can actually see. And so that visual component obviously is going to make it a lot more traumatic for 911 call responders, despite the fact that, Carbine 911 claims it's going to make everything better, their system,
But that's not what they're arguing though. See, and this is what my next part says. And this is what I found so interesting, is it's saying including solutions like video streaming can actually help combat symptoms of trauma for dispatchers, given that call takers will no longer be left to envision the scenarios in their mind. That's ridiculous, because your point is exactly what I'm saying. If you got a video of these horrible things, that's way worse than just picturing it in your mind. So that's a really odd frame there, isn't it? And I'm wondering what that means in the well-being and how that can be applied in other ways, but we're reading into it at this point, but it seemed interesting nonetheless.
Well, I think this may be a segue actually into having artificial intelligence end up being the people that respond to 911 calls at some point in the future. I don't know if anyone saw this story. I don't think we have it queued up, but Puerto Rico recently, under the guise of COVID-19, they said there was an outbreak of COVID-19 among the 911 call center in Puerto Rico. And so what they had to do was completely shut down the 911 call center in all of Puerto Rico. Saying that, so, okay, so if there's an outbreak of a 911 call center, what do we do? It really opens the door for a lot of this automation of things previously done by people, because in other instances, not necessarily 911 call centers, but like in medical centers, we've heard this a lot, right? That, it's better to replace it with AI, or better to increase distance or things like that, because, using that as an excuse, right? So, it's obviously overkill to shut down your call centers because you had some employees test positive. Does it say if they had symptoms or not? Because we've moved into this, phase of the COVID-19 crisis where it's about cases, not about hospitalizations or deaths or anything like that.
Not a single mention of symptoms in the entire article. So I imagine they're just getting tested, and they said they got a test positive with a 90% potential positive rate.
But, this allows an organization like Carbine 911, if they develop that functionality, to have artificial intelligence, or actually I think Mark 43, which is partnered with Carbine 911. I mentioned earlier that law enforcement sort of AI driven thing backed by Jeff Bezos of Amazon, right? That they could, automatically divert 911 calls through Carbine, for example, to their partner, Mark 43, which immediately contacts the police, right? So, I don't necessarily know if that'll be the case, but based on other trends we've been seeing in other sectors of the economy, they've used COVID-19 or certain employees testing positive to justify making the systems automated, whereas they would previously have involved like a human operator or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be the direction all this is going. At the very least, we need to ask whether or not these are things that are either being allowed to happen or being driven to happen by the very people who have an obvious profit motive or other than profit, just motives that very clearly drive them to maybe look the other way if this is happening. But you know my mind. I'm more set on these long-term agendas, think tanks that seem to be gaming these things out, as we've been showing, and they're just in a way making this happen. I mean, that's maybe conspiratorial seems to be the point of today, but all of this stuff is logical. It really is.
Well, we were talking about just one company today, really, Carbine 911, and how they stand to benefit from this alleged crisis that we're being told is imminent and was previously gamed out by Cybereason and things like that. But what we'll be getting into in our next video is that there are some other companies beyond Carbine 911 that also have very unsettling ties to intelligence, including US intelligence, UK intelligence is another big one that we'll be showing in the next video, and also Israeli intelligence once again, all poised to be the solution to the allegedly imminent cyber attacks from hostile state actors that we are set to experience. And it's worth pointing out too, since we began the video with that testimony, remember back to September 11th, 2001, we were told that the boogeyman, the people allegedly responsible per the official narrative for that, and also initially for the anthrax attacks, right? It was a state actor, Iraq, and it was this ragtag group of extremists, Al-Qaeda, right? And so what we have again now, we have this setup of these domestic extremist groups who are, want to create chaos, allegedly, right? Well, this reminds me of something else the red team said that they said at Cybereason, that it was about, they said they were ethical hackers and they didn't like how democracy was playing out, so they wanted to uproot it. Remember, there's this ideology called accelerationism that mainstream media frequently associates with quote unquote neo-Nazis or white supremacists. They want to accelerate the collapse of the system by doing something just like that excuse that Cybereason's ethical hackers gave, right? So it's interesting to see these claims that the next 9/11 is going to be, this ragtag group of domestic extremists, while at the same time the cyber attack narrative has been set up to occur at the same time with nation state actors. And as we've covered on previous shows, there is an effort to link these groups specifically, these domestic groups specifically to Iran, and the glue they're using to try and stick these groups together, because as I said earlier in the show, it makes no sense for white supremacists, if they really are white supremacists, to go and work with Iran, right? But they're going to claim that the glue that binds them is anti-Semitism. And it's interesting that that is the narrative that is being set up, and look at the extreme involvement of Israeli intelligence specifically in what's being set up here. Really crazy. So anyway, for that second video, we're going to be going into some of these other companies and also focusing specifically on Pennsylvania, specifically the city of Philadelphia, which has been seeded to be the epicenter of 2020 election chaos for well over a month now. And that's how on an interview I did on Sunday, I mentioned that. Now I'm having people say I predicted the unrest in Philadelphia. I think what's going on in Philadelphia right now is honestly the warm up based on a lot of the research that I've accumulated about that over the past week or so. So the second video will be going into all of that, how Philadelphia is the ground zero, the epicenter, it has the bullseye right over it. All of these buzzwords being used to describe Philadelphia just over the past month, different experts, different state officials, all using the same buzzwords in a litany of different articles, all very odd. So, that and some other revelations and ties to the usual suspects in relation to what's going on in Philadelphia right now. We'll be getting into that in the next video.
Yeah, and I recommend you guys all tune in, because I hope she mentioned this on Slow News Day, but Whitney and I have been talking about this. She's been tweeting things about this well before there was anything even starting there. And it's not because she's psychic, it's because she's researching this stuff and seeing the way that they're playing these things out. And they tend to, I mean, it's almost jokingly that they tend to do the same old thing over and over. And it's very clear that they're playing these same efforts in the same ways. And as you just laid out, the tie over to 9/11 and the Al-Qaeda aspect, it's exactly, they've got, as the joke I've made in the past, they've got play 1, 2, and 3, and they just vary it up, and they just, and it's what we're seeing today. And so do you want me to wrap it up, Whitney, or do you want to end us here?
I'll go for it. I already sort of said my concluding statement. So.
Good. Well, thank you everybody for being here. And this video will be out on Rockfin, I believe, first. Thank you for being here for, I guess, the first Unlimited Hangout, Last American Vagabond joint effort. So this will be out on all the other channels as well. And thank you everybody for being here. And as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
And every counterterrorism professional I speak to in the federal government and overseas feels like we are at the doorstep of another 9/11, maybe not something that catastrophic in terms of the visual or the numbers, but that we can see it building and we don't quite know how to stop it.